Welcome to another thrilling historical western mail-order bride romance audiobook. If you are new to our channel, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our daily releases of captivating historical western romance stories. And if you enjoy our content, don't forget to leave a like to show your support. For our loyal listeners, welcome back. Excited to have you here again. Shall we begin? Act 1. The warm glow of flickering lanterns cast shadows over the dusty floorboards of the saloon, painting the room in a muted amber light. The air was thick with the musky scent of whiskey, sweat, and smoke, lingering like a forgotten secret, stubbornly refusing to be uncovered. A soft murmur of voices mixed with the clink of glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter. The sound of boots scraping across wood echoed in the corners of the low-ceilinged room, as men sat at tables, their gazes fixed on the woman at the far end, perched on a rickety wooden stool in front of the piano. Sarah O'Malley stood alone in the centre of the room, her voice a haunting melody that wove through the haze of the saloon like a whispered prayer. The song she sang was slow, each note heavy with an aching longing that seemed to touch something deep inside everyone who listened. Her green eyes, glittering with an intensity that few dared to approach, scanned the room, but she hardly saw the faces of the men who watched her. She saw only the past. Her past, and the gnawing sense of regret that had plagued her for so long. The low piano chords wove with the pain in her voice, a pain that wasn't just the result of a heartbreak, but the slow unravelling of a life that had once seemed so sure, so stable. As she sang, memories rushed through her like an unstoppable flood, threatening to pull her under. There had been love once, hadn't there? At least, that's what she had thought. A love so consuming, so intoxicating, that she had given herself to it without hesitation. But love had turned to betrayal, and betrayal had turned to the unrelenting fire of shame that had driven her to this place. In the back of the room, a few men leaned closer to the edge of their chairs, drawn by the sorrow in her voice. But Sarah didn't see them. Her mind drifted back to the chaos that had erupted not long ago, of a man's promises shattered by lies, of whispered gossip and judgments, and the sharp sting of truth she had never wanted to face. She had believed in him. She had trusted him. But all he had given her in return were broken promises, and a reputation tarnished beyond repair. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached the bridge of the song, her fingers curling around the worn edge of the piano as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. She thought of the night it all fell apart. The night the betrayal had come to light, like a cruel storm that tore apart everything she had known. The sharp glare of torches, the shouts in the street, and the harsh condemning words that had cut deeper than any knife. Her voice wavered, the pain of that night threatening to surface, but she swallowed it down, pushing forward with the song. The men in the saloon were no more than shadows to her now. She was lost in the music, lost in the tangled web of memories that clung to her every breath. The last note drifted through the room like a fading sigh, and she released the tension in her chest, closing her eyes for just a moment, allowing the silence that followed to settle over her like a blanket. The applause was polite but distant, a reminder that she was just another performer here, another nameless woman with a song to sing and a past to bury. With a soft smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, Sarah rose from the piano bench, her movements graceful yet mechanical. As she walked off the stage and into the shadows of the saloon, the whispers began again, soft but unmistakable. That's her, the one who... Shameful, they say. She's just a damned fool, putting on a good show, but... Sarah's heart thudded painfully in her chest, but she pressed on, the weight of her past growing heavier with each step. She would never escape it. No matter how far she ran, it would always follow her. The room was small, sparsely furnished, with only a faded mirror and a battered dresser that had seen better days. The soft rustle of fabric filled the quiet, as Sarah moved swiftly, pulling the few belongings she could carry into a threadbare carpet bag. Her hands trembled as she folded her few remaining dresses, dresses that had once held the promise of a life she would never have. Each piece of clothing was a reminder of the woman she had been, a woman who had trusted the wrong man, the wrong choices, and the wrong dreams. She paused for a moment, her gaze drifting to the small trunk in the corner of the room. It was filled with memories, memories she had tried to bury, but they refused to stay hidden. The soft creak of the trunk's lid echoed in the silence as she opened it and began to sift through the contents. A faded locket, a stack of old letters, a silk handkerchief stained with tears. Sarah closed her eyes for just a moment, letting the rush of memories flood her once more. She could almost hear his voice, feel the warmth of his touch, the promises he had whispered in her ear, promises of love, promises of forever. But forever had been a lie. With a sharp breath she closed the trunk and locked it tight. She couldn't afford to keep any part of him now, not even the memories. They had burned her, and she wouldn't let them consume her any longer. The weight of the bag in her hand felt heavier now, as though it carried all the guilt and regret she had buried deep inside. She could still hear the sounds of the saloon, the laughter and the clinking of glasses, but it all seemed so distant, so removed from the life she had known. She was leaving it behind, just as she was leaving behind the pieces of herself she no longer recognized. The door creaked as she opened it, and Sarah stepped into the hallway, glancing back only once. There would be no turning back now. The streets outside were already shadowed by night, and the world beyond this small room seemed both foreign and familiar all at once. The only thing she knew for sure was that she couldn't stay here, couldn't live with the shame any longer. As her boots hit the dirt street, she walked faster, driven by a single thought: rebirth. She wasn't sure where the road would lead her, but the burden of guilt that had held her in place for far too long was finally lifting. With every step she felt the chains loosen, felt the weight of her past begin to fade into the distance. Hope. It was a dangerous thing, but it was all she had left, and perhaps, just perhaps, it was enough to carry her toward a new beginning. The creaky door of the boarding house swung open, its hinges protesting against the morning light that spilled into the dimly lit hallway. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, the weight of her past clinging to her as tightly as the dust on her boots. She could smell the faint scent of soap and old wood, but combination of comfort and age. But there was no hiding the unease that settled into her chest like an unwelcome guest. The room was small, with faded wallpaper and a few mismatched pieces of furniture. A solitary staircase wound its way up to the second floor, and the soft murmur of voices from the adjoining rooms hinted at the presence of a few other travellers. But it was the woman standing behind the counter that caught Sarah's attention. She was older than Sarah by a few years, with lines etched into her face that spoke of a life well lived, but not without its share of hardship. Her grey hair was pulled back into a tidy bun, and she wore a plain dress, simple but well-fed. There was something warm in the way the woman's blue eyes observed Sarah, but also a caution that didn't go unnoticed. "Morning, ma'am," the innkeeper greeted, her voice rich and pleasant, though her gaze lingered for just a heartbeat too long. "You look like you've travelled a long way." Sarah nodded, trying her best to smile, but her lips felt stiff. The woman's sharp eyes never seemed to miss a thing. She had seen too many weary souls come and go from this place, each one wearing their own brand of sadness, their own burden of secrets. And Sarah's secret was no different from any other. "I've been on the road for a while," Sarah said quietly, her voice low, almost as if she were speaking to herself rather than the innkeeper. She placed her worn bag on the counter with a soft thud. The weight of it, of everything it contained, seemed to settle more heavily with every passing second. The innkeeper studied her for a moment longer before reaching for a ledger with worn edges. "I have a room for you. Only one, mind you. It's modest, but it's clean enough." She scribbled something in the ledger and then looked up at Sarah again, her expression softening just a touch. "It's been a slow week. Not many guests passing through Silver Creek these days." Sarah glanced down, nervously tugging at the sleeve of her faded jacket. She could feel the woman's gaze on her, probing, searching. She could sense the unspoken question in the air, the one everyone in this town would surely ask. What was she running from? And more importantly, could she hide it well enough here to stay? "Thank you," Sarah said softly, trying to meet the innkeeper's eyes, but her gaze dropped quickly. She wasn't sure why, but she felt the urge to explain herself, to tell this woman that she wasn't the person they would think her to be, that she wasn't just another wayward woman who'd come to Silver Creek hoping to start over with a clean slate. But she didn't. She couldn't. Not yet. The innkeeper seemed to sense this hesitation, but she said nothing. Instead, she handed Sarah a brass key, her fingers brushing Sarah's lightly. "Room number 3 on the 2nd floor," she said, her tone gentle but not without a hint of knowing. "You rest easy now. Silver Creek's a quiet place, but sometimes quiet is exactly what a person needs to find peace." Sarah took the key, her hand trembling slightly, and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. She turned away, her heart heavy with the weight of the woman's unspoken words. The door behind her closed with a soft click, and Sarah climbed the narrow stairs, the soft creak of the boards underfoot filling the otherwise silent house. Her mind whirled with questions, each one as troubling as the last. Would she find peace here? Or would the ghosts of her past follow her like shadows, always lingering just behind her, no matter how far she ran? The morning sun had just begun to peek through the slats of the boarding-house window, casting thin beams of light across the worn floorboards. The smell of coffee and sizzling bacon drifted up from the kitchen below, a welcome change from the stale, dry air of the trail. Sarah sat at the small wooden table by the window, a simple breakfast in front of her, a crust of bread, a thin slice of bacon, and a cup of weak coffee. Her fingers toyed with the edge of the bread, tearing it into small pieces, but her mind was a million miles away. She was tired. Her body ached from the long ride, but it was more than that. It was the weight of her past, the relentless echo of decisions she could never undo. And yet, here she was, in this small town where nobody knew her, where the air still felt unfamiliar. The soft murmur of voices below reached her ears, snippets of conversation filtering up from the kitchen as the innkeeper spoke with a couple of other travellers. Sarah's gaze lingered on the sunlight filtering through the window, but her mind remained focused on the one piece of news she had overheard that caught her attention. "There's talk of work on the Kirkland ranch," the innkeeper had said. "They're hiring hands, anyone willing to lend a hand, even if it's just for a while. The ranch has been struggling, but they're desperate for help. The place is in bad shape, but it could be a way to get by." Sarah's heart skipped a beat at the mention of the ranch. She had heard rumours of Kirkland Ranch before, whispers about its rocky past and the troubled owners who had been fighting to keep it afloat. Desperation clung to that place like dust, but there was something in the way the innkeeper had spoken of it that stirred something deep inside Sarah. A chance, a new start. Maybe it wasn't much, but it was something. She set the bread down and wiped her hands on her skirt, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. There was no denying the exhaustion in her bones, the overwhelming urge to rest, to fade into this quiet town and never be heard from again. But that would never work, not for her. She had no desire to be a ghost in this place, a forgotten face in the crowd. She had come to Silver Creek for a reason, and now, it seemed, the town had presented her with an opportunity, a chance to prove she was more than the sum of her mistakes, more than the woman she had been. Her fingers closed around the edge of the coffee cup, her decision solidifying as she took a slow sip. The warmth of the coffee seemed to settle in her chest, filling her with a glimmer of hope. She had nothing left to lose. The past was behind her, and this new life, this new chance, was all she had. Her heart thudded with determination as she rose from the table, the creaking of the floor beneath her feet steady and sure. She was going to take the job at the ranch. She didn't know what the future would hold, or whether she would ever truly escape her past, but she knew this. She would make her own future, no matter the cost. With one last glance out the window, Sarah O'Malley stepped into the morning light, ready to leave her old life behind and embrace the unknown. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows over the vast expanse of land that stretched before Sarah. She had been walking for what felt like hours, her legs aching from the long journey, the weight of her simple bag growing heavier with every step. The ranch loomed ahead like a battleground, a place where sweat and toil were the currency of survival. Sarah stood at the edge of the property, her gaze fixed on the dilapidated buildings and the men and women working under the relentless sun. It was nothing like the life she had known, nothing like the delicate existence she had once taken for granted. The land was rough, wild and untamed, much like the people who worked it. The barns were worn and crooked, the fences sagging under the strain of time and neglect. Sarah could hear the sharp crack of leather against cattle hides, the low bellow of the cows as they were herded into pens, and the steady rhythm of boots crunching against the dirt. It was a harsh, unforgiving world, and for a moment she felt like a fragile bird in the midst of a storm. Her heart raced, and she drew in a sharp breath as she stepped forward. The ground beneath her feet was dry, cracked and rough, a stark contrast to the soft, cultivated earth of her family's farm. This was a place where survival was earned, not given. The air felt thick with dust and the lingering smell of sweat, but it was also filled with something else, something raw and alive. It was a place where the week didn't last long, where the land stripped away any pretensions and revealed a person's true worth. As she made her way toward the group of ranch hands gathered near the fence, she could feel the eyes of the men upon her. There was no mistaking the way they watched her approach. Curious, yet cautious, sizing her up with a mixture of skepticism and something else she couldn't quite place. They whispered among themselves, their voices low, their glances quick. Sarah's stomach twisted. She wasn't sure what they saw when they looked at her, but she knew she was different. Too delicate, too soft for a place like this. She adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder, trying to steady the fluttering in her chest. The sun beat down on her back, and the heat pressed in from every direction, but she kept her chin up, her stride steady. There was no room for doubt now. She had made her choice. When she reached the edge of the group, one of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a face weathered by years of sun, looked her up and down, his eyes lingering for a moment too long. She offered him a tentative smile, but it didn't seem to soften the hardness in his gaze. He nodded toward the boss's cabin, a small, squat building at the center of the ranch, and without a word he turned back to his work, leaving her to stand there, exposed and vulnerable under the searing heat. Sarah's gaze drifted to the workers. Some were mending fences, others were tending to the cattle, their movements fluid and practiced, as though the work was second nature to them. But despite their concentration, there was an unmistakable tension in the air, a feeling that this was a place where no one could afford to be weak or distracted. She took a deep breath and walked toward the cabin, each step feeling heavier than the last. As she approached, the door creaked open, revealing a woman standing in the doorway, her face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. The woman's eyes studied her for a moment, and then she nodded once, a silent invitation to come in. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of tobacco and the faint scent of leather. The woman who had greeted Sarah gestured toward a small table near the window where a man sat, his back to her as he leaned over a piece of paper, scribbling something with a pencil. "Dusty Lawson," the woman said, her voice low and matter-of-fact. "He's the one you'll be working with." Sarah hesitated, her fingers clutching the edge of her bag as she stepped closer to the table. The man hadn't moved, but there was something about him that made her heart race. He was tall, taller than most of the men she had seen so far, and his shoulders were broad, his posture relaxed but not lazy. He wore a faded shirt and worn boots, the fabric of his jeans creased from long hours of work. His hands, calloused and rough, held the pencil with ease, but it was his eyes that caught Sarah's attention. When he finally looked up, their gazes met across the table, and for a split second the world seemed to freeze. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. There was something haunted about him, a quiet sadness that clung to him like a second skin. But there was also a glimmer of something else, something fierce and unyielding, like the land he worked on. Dusty set the pencil down slowly, his gaze still fixed on her, as if he was sizing her up in the same way the others had. He didn't smile or offer any greeting, but there was a slight curve to his lips that might have been the beginning of one. He nodded toward the chair across from him. "Sit down," he said, his voice low, rough from too many years of hard labor under the sun. Sarah moved forward, her heart pounding in her chest as she lowered herself into the chair. The silence between them stretched, thick and palpable. She could feel his eyes on her, his quiet assessment weighing heavily on her. "I'm Dusty," he repeated, as if it were an afterthought. "You're the one looking for work." "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and sat up a little straighter. "I've travelled a long way. I'll do anything you need." He studied her for a moment longer, his gaze never wavering. There was something in the way he looked at her, almost as if he could see right through her, past the delicate facade she had built to protect herself. She wasn't sure if it was discomfort or curiosity, but something stirred in her chest. "Anything?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of something both guarded and challenging. Sarah nodded, her hands tightening around the edge of her bag. "I've worked on a farm before. I can handle myself." Dusty leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. His eyes flicked toward the window where the bright light of the sun streamed in, casting shadows across the room. His expression softened slightly, but only for a moment. "Work here's different than anything you've done," he said quietly. "This land's hard. It'll test you. But if you've got the grit, you'll make it." Sarah didn't respond right away. Instead, she met his gaze, the intensity of the moment hanging in the air between them. For the first time since she had arrived, she felt something shift. She wasn't sure if it was the way his voice softened just slightly, or if it was the silent understanding that passed between them, but she knew this was more than just a job. It was a test, one she wasn't sure she could pass, but she was willing to try. The first day on the ranch was harder than Sarah could have ever imagined. The sun beat down on her back as she worked, her hands raw and blistered from the unfamiliar tasks. The men and women who worked the land barely spared her a glance as they went about their tasks, their focus unwavering. But no matter how hard she tried to keep up, the sweat dripped down her face, the dust caked her clothes, and the exhaustion threatened to drag her under. By the time the sun began to sink below the horizon, Sarah felt like she had been run ragged. Her muscles ached, and her bones felt as if they had been worn down by the sheer force of the day's work. She had mended fences, carried water, and even helped herd cattle, each task more demanding than the last. She collapsed onto a bench near the cabin, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried to steady herself. The day had drained her, and yet there was a sense of quiet pride in the ache of her body, the knowledge that she had survived it. But even that small victory didn't dull the feeling of isolation that settled over her like a heavy blanket. The ranch hands had barely spoken to her all day, and the silence between them had been deafening. But just as she was about to resign herself to the loneliness, a figure appeared beside her. It was one of the ranch hands, a younger man with a friendly smile, his face still covered in dirt from the day's work. He handed her a canteen of water, his expression kind but not overly familiar. "Here," he said, his voice soft. "Thought you might need this." Sarah accepted it gratefully, her parched throat aching for the relief. She drank deeply, the cool water soothing her dry mouth. "Thank you," she said, wiping her lips with the back of her hand. The young man smiled and nodded. "It's a tough place, but you'll get used to it. Just got to keep pushing through." For the first time since she had arrived, Sarah felt a spark of hope. The ranch wasn't the easy life she had dreamed of, but maybe, just maybe, it could be the fresh start she needed. She met his eyes, offering a tentative smile of her own. "I'll make it," she said, her voice steady despite the weariness that still clung to her. "I have to." And in that moment, she believed it. The first rays of dawn kissed the earth, casting a soft golden hue over the sprawling ranch. The air, cool and crisp, still held the breath of night, but it was soon to be swallowed by the relentless heat of the sun that was climbing steadily in the sky. Sarah stood at the edge of the field, watching as the ranch slowly came alive around her. The distant sounds of hooves, the low murmur of voices, and the creak of wood and leather filled the air, each sound a reminder of the life that surrounded her, hard, demanding, and unyielding. Dusty was already at the far end of the pasture, his broad back a steady figure against the morning light. He moved with ease, his body a machine forged by years of hard work. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before she followed, her own body stiff from the unfamiliar tasks of the previous day. The ranch had a rhythm to it, a pulse that was both exhausting and invigorating, and she was slowly learning to match it. As she reached him, Dusty didn't look up, but she could feel the shift in the air, as if he had sensed her approach without needing to see her. He was standing by a weathered fence post, his hands rough and steady as he worked, tightening the wire and mending a section of the fence that had been worn down by the restless cattle. The smell of earth and sweat hung in the air as the sounds of their labor merged, hammers striking nails, the scrape of wire being tightened, the low murmur of the animals grazing nearby. It was a song of the land, a song that only those who had worked it truly understood. Sarah stepped forward, picking up the tools he had left behind. Her fingers were stiff from the cold morning air, but she gripped the hammer with determination, finding her rhythm as she drove nails into the wooden post. The work was hard, the physical exertion beginning to show in the slight tremor of her hands, but with each swing she felt something inside her shift, something heavy lifting, piece by piece, as the labor demanded her full attention. She didn't look at Dusty. Instead, she focused on the task at hand. The rhythm of it, the feel of the hammer in her hand, the satisfaction of each nail securing the fence in place. With every movement her mind cleared, the ghosts of her past fading into the background, replaced by the quiet determination of the work. Dusty moved beside her, working silently, his actions deliberate and precise. There was no need for words between them. The language of their labor spoke louder than any conversation could. As the sun crept higher, the temperature began to rise, the sweat on their skin mixing with the dust of the earth. The heat was relentless, but there was something about the work that made it bearable, something that grounded Sarah, made her feel as if she were becoming part of this place, part of the rhythm that Dusty had long ago mastered. By the time they finished mending the fence, Sarah's arms were sore, her muscles protesting the work, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the ache. She could feel the connection to the land, to the work, and to Dusty in a way that transcended words. In the silence of the morning, as they walked to the next task, something had shifted between them. A bond forged in shared labor, in sweat and toil, in the unspoken understanding that this was how trust was built. Piece by piece. The sun was high in the sky by the time Sarah and Dusty took their first break of the day. The land around them shimmered with heat, and the sound of the horses' hooves and the cattle's low calls had faded into the background. They had worked side by side for hours, the rhythm of their tasks now ingrained in Sarah's muscles, her body moving almost without thinking. But even with the satisfaction of a job well done, she felt a weariness deep in her bones, an exhaustion that wasn't just physical, but emotional. Dusty led her toward a patch of shade beneath a sprawling cottonwood tree, its branches heavy with leaves, offering a rare respite from the sun. They sat in the cool grass, the scent of earth and leaves filling the air, as Sarah leaned back against the trunk, her eyes closing for a moment to rest. Dusty, however, remained alert, his posture stiff as he took a swig from his water canteen, his gaze lingering on the distant hills. There was a quiet sadness in his eyes, something that Sarah had sensed from the moment they had met. She didn't know what it was, but she could feel it. An ache in him that mirrored her own. "Long day already," he murmured, his voice rough with the dust of the morning's labor. His gaze shifted to her, and for a brief moment their eyes met. There was a flicker of something raw and vulnerable, that passed between them. Sarah swallowed, unsure of how to respond. She had spent the morning fighting the urge to look at him too closely, to acknowledge the quiet storm that seemed to brew just beneath his surface. But in the quiet of this moment, beneath the shelter of the tree, something in her shifted. There was no pretending here, no facade of strength to hide behind. In this place, in the midst of the unforgiving ranch life, she was just a woman, worn and tired with a past she couldn't outrun. "I didn't know what I was getting myself into," she admitted, her voice soft as she gazed down at her hands. Her fingers were raw from the work, the calluses starting to form, and for the first time she didn't mind. Eerily, "I thought it would be easier. I thought I could handle it." Dusty shifted beside her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing, and Sarah feared that he had already moved past her, already shut off whatever small connection they had begun to forge. But then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "None of it's easy," he said, his words laced with something hard, something etched into him over years of hardship. "Life here doesn't give you much time for comfort or softness. It takes everything from you, piece by piece, until all you're left with is the work, and even that's not guaranteed." Sarah looked at him then, her gaze lingering on his face. She saw the shadows in his eyes, the weight of something unspoken. And she felt a stirring of empathy, a recognition that he too was carrying a burden. He didn't look at her, didn't seem to expect any response, but Sarah's heart ached for him. She understood that quiet pain, that lingering sorrow. It was a feeling she knew too well. "My family?" "They're gone," Dusty said after a long silence. His voice was soft but steady, as if he had said it 1,000 times before. "Lost 'em in a fire. I was the only one left. Didn't know how to keep going after that." Sarah's chest tightened at his words, and she looked away, her throat closing. She had never spoken of her own past, of the betrayal that had driven her to this place, but in that moment she realized she didn't have to. Dusty's pain was enough. She could feel it, like a weight in the air between them. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with the empathy she felt for him. "I can't imagine what that must have been like." Dusty glanced at her then, his eyes dark and unreadable, but there was something in his gaze that softened just for a moment. "It's been a long time," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of resignation, "but it doesn't go away. You just learn to live with it." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding all too well. The past never really left, never really faded. It stayed with you, buried deep inside, gnawing at you when you least expected it. "We lost someone too," Sarah said, her voice small, barely above a whisper. The words seemed to hang in the air, fragile and trembling, but she couldn't take them back now. "I trusted him, and he broke me." Dusty didn't ask for details, didn't push her to say more, but he didn't have to. The shared silence between them spoke volumes. They didn't need words to understand each other. For a long moment they sat there, side by side beneath the cottonwood, each carrying the weight of their own pain, but finding comfort in the quiet understanding that passed between them. It was the beginning of something unspoken. A bond forged not just in shared labor, but in shared vulnerability. And as the afternoon sun rose higher, casting longer shadows across the ground, Sarah felt something inside her shift. A small, quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to heal here. To start over, to rebuild, piece by piece, just like the ranch itself. The evening air was thick with the earthy scent of pine and the soft whispers of crickets as the sun dipped low beneath the horizon, painting the sky in shades of lavender and gold. The workday had ended, and the ranch had taken on a different rhythm. The men and women who had labored beneath the unforgiving sun now gathered around a crackling fire, their voices rising and falling in a low hum of conversation. The sounds of labor had been replaced by laughter, the clinking of metal mugs, and the sizzle of meat cooking over the fire. It was a communal ritual, a ritual Sarah had never known but was beginning to understand. She stood at the edge of the gathering, unsure of her place, watching as the others moved easily among one another. The firelight flickered across their faces, casting warm, golden glows that softened the harsh edges of the day. The heat of the flames contrasted with the coolness of the evening air. But the warmth was more than just the fire. It was in the camaraderie that filled the space between them, in the way the group came together, as if the ranch was its own little world, a place where everyone was both a stranger and family. Dusty was at the center of it all, his voice deep and steady as he spoke to the others. His broad shoulders were relaxed now, no longer tense from the day's work. He was smiling. Just a little, but it was enough for Sarah to notice. There was something about him that drew her in, something beyond the quiet, guarded exterior that he had worn so firmly since her arrival. She hadn't quite found her place in this world yet, but she could feel herself inching closer to it, as if the warmth of the fire and the laughter in the air were slowly loosening the tight grip of isolation she had carried with her for so long. The communal table was set with simple food, fresh bread, roasted vegetables, and slabs of meat sizzling from the fire. As Sarah moved closer, a woman with dark, wavy hair caught her eye and waved her over with a welcoming smile. "Come on, sit down," the woman said warmly. "There's plenty for everyone." Sarah hesitated, her feet feeling like lead as she approached. She wasn't sure if she belonged here, if her presence was an intrusion, but the warmth in the woman's voice was hard to ignore. With a deep breath, Sarah pulled out the chair and sat down beside her, the seat creaking under her weight. As she did, she noticed the others glance up, some with curious eyes, others with knowing, accepting smiles. There were no questions, no probing stares, just the quiet acceptance of one more soul to share in the evening's meal. Dusty looked up from his conversation then, his gaze briefly meeting Sarah's across the fire. For a moment the world seemed to pause as the flickering light of the fire caught the quiet intensity in his eyes. It was a fleeting moment, gone as quickly as it came, but Sarah felt it. A connection, subtle and yet undeniable. "You're welcome to help yourself," the woman beside Sarah said, passing a bowl of beans her way. "We've got more than enough, and I'm sure you're hungry after today." "Thank you," Sarah said softly, her fingers brushing the edge of the bowl before she took it from her. The warmth of the food was comforting, but it was the warmth of the people around her, the casual ease with which they shared their stories and laughter, that made the meal something more. They ate in a comfortable silence for a while, the crackling of the fire filling the space between them. Sarah felt a strange peace settle over her, a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she had been searching for. The evening stretched on, and with every passing minute, the walls she had so carefully constructed around herself began to crumble piece by piece. After a time, one of the ranch hands, a younger man with a boyish grin, stood and stretched, his voice light and easy. "All right, who's up for a little music? The old fiddle's been gathering dust all day, and I reckon it's about time we gave it a good run." A few of the men laughed, and someone else called out in jest, "Don't break the strings, Henry." Henry gave a dramatic bow and set to work tuning the fiddle, his fingers moving with surprising skill as he prepared for the impromptu performance. Sarah watched, her heart softening at the sight of them, these people who had no need for grand gestures, who found joy in the simple moments of life. She had spent so much of her life hiding from the world, so much time believing she didn't belong, that she had forgotten how beautiful it could be to be part of something so raw and real. As the first strains of the fiddle echoed through the cool night air, the others began to hum along, tapping their feet in time with the music. Laughter and song filled the space, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah let herself smile. Dusty had stood up, moving toward the fire as the music swelled, his strong hands reaching for his guitar that had been resting nearby. With one fluid motion, he strummed the first chord, his deep voice joining the chorus. The music wrapped around Sarah like a warm blanket, soothing the weariness of the day and reminding her of the things she had forgotten, things like connection, laughter, and the joy that came with simply being in the moment. The evening stretched on, the fire flickering low, and the music flowing like a river that couldn't be stopped. Sarah's heart was light, the ache in her chest from so many years of solitude beginning to ease. She looked around at the faces around her, faces that had become familiar in the short time she had been here, and she felt something shift within her. For the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider. As the music played and the fire burned low, Dusty's voice rose above the others, his tone rich and warm, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Sarah watched him, her breath catching in her throat, as their gazes met once more. It was brief, just a glance, but in that moment something passed between them. Something unspoken but understood. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know if she could ever truly escape the past that had clung to her for so long, but in this moment, under the starlit sky, surrounded by laughter and music, Sarah felt a sense of hope stirring within her. She was building something here, a foundation, slow and steady, brick by brick, a foundation of trust, of connection, of something that could one day grow into something more. For the first time since she had arrived, she felt like she was truly home. The day had been long, the work exhausting. Sarah's hands were raw from the day's labor, her body sore in places she hadn't even realized she had muscles. As the evening sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, she found herself seeking a quiet corner of the ranch. Away from the laughter and the voices of the others, she needed solitude, even if just for a little while. The air was cooler now, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and the faintest hint of the coming night. She had walked far from the main campfire to a secluded part of the ranch where the land rolled gently into a small hill. From here, the view of the setting sun was breathtaking. A blaze of oranges and reds that seemed to bleed into the sky, painting it with a beauty that made Sarah's chest tighten. She sat on a large, flat rock, her legs drawn to her chest, the roughness of the stone beneath her providing a small comfort against the ache in her bones. Her gaze remained fixed on the horizon as the sun slowly sank lower, casting a final golden light over the land. The colors, brilliant and fleeting, seemed to reflect the tumult inside her. Beautiful, yet transient, like a moment she knew she couldn't hold on to. The emotional weight of the day settled heavily over her. The work had been grueling, but that was nothing compared to the quiet ache that still lingered in her heart. It was a familiar feeling, one she had carried for so long. Grief, guilt, regret, all of it wrapped tightly inside her like a tangled knot she couldn't quite untangle. She closed her eyes, letting the cool breeze brush her face, trying to shut out the storm of emotions that swirled just beneath the surface. For a moment, it almost worked. Almost. But the quiet didn't bring peace. It only made the loneliness more acute. "Mind if I join you?" The deep, steady voice broke through the silence, startling her for a brief second. She looked up to find Dusty standing a few feet away, his presence as quiet as the land around them, yet somehow as solid as the earth beneath her. His figure was outlined against the fading light, the contours of his face softened by the warmth of the setting sun. She didn't answer right away, unsure of what to say or how to explain the strange, aching void inside her. But his presence, calm and unassuming, seemed to draw her in, so she simply nodded. Dusty moved silently to sit beside her, his posture easy but alert, like someone who had long since learned to listen to the land. He didn't speak at first, didn't press her for conversation. Instead, they sat there together, side by side, watching the colors shift across the sky as the sun made its final descent. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was comfortable, even soothing. It was the kind of silence that didn't demand anything, didn't ask for words or explanations, just allowed each of them to simply be. Sarah felt the tension in her shoulders ease ever so slightly, as if the very act of sharing this quiet moment with someone had brought a measure of peace. She could feel Dusty's presence beside her, solid and steady like the land itself. There was something about him that was grounding, something that made her feel just a little less alone. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They simply watched the sky change, the colors fading into a deep, inky blue as the first stars began to emerge. In the distance, the sound of the others carried on the wind, the crackling of the fire, the low murmur of conversation. But here, in this quiet corner of the world, there was only the two of them, sharing a moment of peace beneath the vast, endless sky. By the time the sun had fully set, the sky now a blanket of stars, Sarah and Dusty found their way back to the campfire. The warmth of the flames felt good against the coolness of the night, but it also made the ache in Sarah's chest more palpable, more present. The firelight flickered across their faces, casting long shadows that seemed to mimic the darkness she carried inside. The others were already deep in conversation, laughter rising and falling in the background, but Sarah felt disconnected from them. The walls she had so carefully built around herself were still too high, the gulf between her and the rest of the world still too wide. She wanted to reach out, to be a part of it all, but something always held her back. She stood near the edge of the firelight, staring into the flames, when Dusty's voice came from behind her. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" His words were gentle, a quiet observation rather than an accusation. Sarah turned to look at him, finding him standing just a few feet away, his hands resting on his hips. There was something in his gaze, a knowingness that sent a shiver down her spine. "I suppose I am," she answered quietly, her gaze flicking to the fire before settling back on him. There was no anger in his eyes, no judgment, just understanding, as if he knew exactly what she was feeling. There was a pause, a brief moment of silence between them, before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to leave, but I didn't have a choice." Dusty didn't ask for details, didn't push her to explain. Instead, he nodded, his expression softening. "Sometimes we don't get to choose the road we're on," he said quietly. His eyes drifted toward the fire, and for a moment Sarah thought he might not say anything more. But then, almost as an afterthought, he spoke again, his voice rough but steady. "I didn't choose this life, either." Sarah looked at him then, really looked at him, her heart aching for the quiet sorrow that lingered in his eyes. There was something about him, something about the way he carried himself, that made her feel as though he understood pain in a way few people ever could. "I lost everything," he said, his voice low, as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. "My family, my home, it all burned down one night. I was the only one who made it out." Sarah's breath caught in her throat, the weight of his words settling heavily in the air between them. She could feel the rawness in his voice, the depth of the loss he carried. It was familiar, that ache. She knew it well. The pain of losing something that had been so dear, so deeply intertwined with who you were. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. Dusty gave a small, wry smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's been a long time. You learned to live with it?" There was another long silence, both of them lost in the weight of their shared understanding. And then, quietly, Sarah spoke again, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "I don't know how to stop carrying it. The guilt, the regret." Dusty turned to face her fully, his expression softening, his eyes dark and steady. "You don't have to carry it alone," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Not any more." Sarah's chest tightened at his words, the unspoken promise of understanding and support echoing in the space between them. She didn't know what the future held, or whether she could ever truly let go of the past that had clung to her so tightly. But in this moment, with Dusty standing beside her, his quiet strength grounding her, she felt the first flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could begin to let it go. The night stretched on, the stars high above them, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt like she wasn't so alone anymore. The fire crackled softly, and together in the quiet of the night they shared something deeper than words, something that, for both of them, had been a long time coming. And in that silence they began to heal. The night had fallen into a deep, velvet stillness, the only sounds the crackling of the campfire and the gentle whisper of the wind through the tall grasses. The stars above were sharp, scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. The fire, now reduced to a bed of glowing embers, threw a warm, soft light on the faces gathered around it. But the night itself felt infinite, stretching on forever. Sarah sat near the fire, her legs drawn up beneath her, arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the shifting glow of the embers. Her heart still echoed with the rawness of the conversation she had shared with Dusty. The weight of their confessions, the vulnerability they had both revealed, settled quietly between them like a blanket, both comforting and heavy. There was a strange kind of peace in it, a quiet acceptance that came from knowing they didn't have to hide their scars, that the weight of their pasts didn't need to define the future they were slowly, tentatively building here. The firelight danced in Dusty's eyes as he stared into the embers, his jaw tight, the muscles in his neck visible as he shifted slightly. He was quieter than usual tonight, the rawness of their conversation perhaps weighing on him as much as it did on her. Yet there was something unspoken between them now, a bond forged in shared understanding, in silent promises that didn't need words to be understood. She didn't know how long they had been sitting there, the fire now reduced to nothing but glowing ashes, but the silence felt right, like it was a part of the healing process, the kind of silence that wasn't awkward or uncomfortable, but rather a shared space where two people could just exist. The night air had grown cooler, and Sarah wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, shivering slightly against the evening chill. She could feel the weight of the day's exhaustion pressing down on her, but there was something more than that, a heaviness in her chest, a quiet tug in her heart that she couldn't quite explain. It was the echo of a promise, one she wasn't sure she was ready to make, but couldn't help feeling was already being forged between them. A promise of resilience, of support, of healing even when it seemed impossible. Dusty shifted beside her, the soft rustling of his movements pulling her from her thoughts. He hadn't said much since their conversation earlier, but the silence between them didn't feel strained. Instead, it was a space where they both knew there was more to be said, but no words were necessary. His presence, quiet and solid, was enough. Then, without a word, he extended his hand toward her. His palm was open, an unspoken invitation that seemed to carry with it the weight of everything that had come before, the shared burdens, the raw confessions, the understanding that had passed between them. For a long moment, Sarah didn't move. She wasn't sure why she hesitated, but something inside her held her back. A fear she couldn't name, a hesitation she didn't want to face. She had spent so long keeping her distance from others, guarding herself from the pain of losing someone else, that even this simple gesture felt like a risk. But as she looked at Dusty, his face soft in the dim glow of the embers, she realized that the distance between them wasn't something she needed to guard against. The connection that had grown between them, fragile yet undeniable, wasn't a threat, it was a lifeline. Slowly, cautiously, Sarah reached out, her hand trembling just slightly as her fingers brushed against his. The contact was brief, just a fleeting moment, but in it was something powerful, a promise unspoken, a quiet understanding that they were no longer alone in their struggles. They didn't have to face the ghosts of their pasts alone. They had each other, in whatever small way that was. Dusty's hand remained there, warm against hers, and for a heartbeat the world around them seemed to fall away. The crackling of the fire, the rustle of the wind, it all disappeared, leaving only the quiet strength of their connection, this shared, unspoken promise. They didn't need to say the words. They didn't need to make grand gestures or vows. The simple act of their hands touching, of their hearts acknowledging each other's pain, was enough. The moment passed just as quickly as it had come, but it left behind something tangible, something that neither of them could name, but both of them could feel. It was a promise of resilience, a promise of support, a promise that they would face whatever came next together, even if the path ahead was unclear, even if the road was long and difficult. In that brief moment, they had both found something they hadn't realized they were searching for, someone to stand with them, someone who understood, someone who would help carry the burden of the past so they could move forward into the future. Sarah pulled her hand back slowly, but the warmth of Dusty's touch lingered in her palm, in her heart. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could face it. Whatever came next, she wasn't facing it alone. Dusty let out a soft sigh, his voice low but steady. "We'll get through it, whatever it is." Sarah nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in days. She didn't need anything more than that. His words, his presence were enough. As the fire continued to burn low, the stars above them shone brighter, and Sarah sat there quietly, her hand resting on her knee, the promise of that brief touch still warming her skin. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time it didn't seem quite as daunting. Together they would face whatever came next. And for now, that was enough. The heat of the afternoon hung heavily over Silver Creek, the sun relentless in its climb toward midday. The dusty streets shimmered under its gaze, the wind carrying with it the scent of dry earth and the faint whisper of distant horses' hooves. It was the kind of day that made everything feel still, as though the very land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Sarah walked slowly through the main street, her boots stirring up little clouds of dust as she passed the rows of modest buildings. The general store was quiet, its wooden sign creaking in the light breeze. A few townsfolk were gathered outside, but their voices were low, their heads bent close together in hushed conversation. Sarah, used to the routine hum of the ranch, felt the sudden weight of the silence around her. It was as if the air had changed, thickened somehow, and it made the back of her neck prickle with unease. She pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the familiar sights of the town, the old church, the saloon at the corner, the bakery where the smell of fresh bread always seemed to linger in the air. Nothing had changed, and yet something felt different. As she passed by a group of women standing near the well, she caught snippets of their conversation, their words barely audible but unmistakably directed at her. Heard she's running from something, never seen anyone come to town with such a look in their eyes. Sarah's steps faltered, but she didn't turn. She knew they were talking about her. The murmurs had started days ago, soft at first, like a breeze rustling through the trees, but now they were louder, more persistent, like a storm gathering on the horizon. She quickened her pace, heading toward the bakery, where the scent of fresh bread might shield her from the weight of their stares. But as she approached the door, she heard another voice, this one familiar. "Sarah, hold up there." She turned slowly, and there, standing by the post office, was Millie, the innkeeper's daughter. Her face was flushed from the midday sun, but her expression was serious, her brow furrowed in concern. "You all right?" Millie asked, her voice low enough that only Sarah could hear. Sarah hesitated. The weight of the town's eyes felt as if it was pressing down on her, the suspicion and curiosity she had hoped to escape, now following her like a shadow. "I'm fine," she replied, offering a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Millie didn't seem convinced. "You've been hearing the talk, haven't you?" she asked, her words heavy with something Sarah couldn't quite place. Sarah nodded, though she didn't speak. The rumours were impossible to ignore now. They were like the dust that settled over the town, coating everything with an unsettling layer of uncertainty. She could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on her every time she stepped out the door. Eyes that judged, whispered and speculated. "Don't pay them any mind," Millie said quickly, though her voice trembled slightly, as if she too could feel the weight of the gossip. "People talk. They don't know what they're saying." But Sarah could see it in Millie's eyes, the hesitation, the doubt, and it made her stomach tighten. She appreciated the effort, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers weren't just about her anymore. Something else had shifted in the town, something she couldn't name. The strange presence of a figure at the edge of town had everyone on edge. Milly glanced over her shoulder, her gaze flicking nervously toward the far edge of the street, where the road dipped and disappeared into the distance. "You heard about the stranger, right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah frowned, her heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" "He's been hanging round the outskirts of Silver Creek. Don't know much about him, just that he don't look like no one from these parts. Folks say he's been asking questions. Some of 'em think he's a bounty hunter, or worse." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She had heard the rumours, bits and pieces from the ranch hands and the townsfolk, but until now they had seemed like idle gossip, the kind that was often born out of boredom and the heat of summer days. But this felt different. "What's he want?" Sarah asked, her voice strained. Milly bit her lip, clearly torn. "I don't know, but folks are talking, Sarah. They're saying you've got something to do with it, with him." The words hit Sarah like a blow, and for a long moment she didn't know how to respond. Her past, her shameful, painful past, wasn't something she had left behind when she crossed the threshold of Silver Creek. It was a shadow that followed her, one that she couldn't outrun. And now it seemed like that shadow was drawing closer, threatening to expose her once again. She wanted to deny it, to pretend it wasn't true, but she couldn't. "I don't know anything about him," she said quietly, her voice shaky. "I haven't seen him." Milly nodded slowly, her face softening in sympathy. "I know you haven't, but I just thought you should know. The town's starting to talk more and more. Some of 'em are saying it's only a matter of time before he shows up here, looking for you." Sarah's chest tightened at the thought. She had worked so hard to bury the past, to build a new life in this quiet little town. But now the remnants of her old life were creeping back in, clawing their way to the surface. "Don't worry about it," Milly said, her voice low and soothing. "I'm sure it'll blow over." But Sarah wasn't so sure. The stranger, the whispers, the darkening air of the town. It all felt like a storm waiting to break. And when it did, she feared there would be nothing left to protect her from the truth. As she turned away from Milly, heading toward the bakery with her heart heavy and her mind spinning, she couldn't shake the feeling that the ghosts of her past were finally catching up to her. And this time, they weren't going to let her hide. The sun was dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fiery orange and dusky pink, as the quiet of Silver Creek began to settle into the calm of twilight. The street lamps flickered to life, casting their warm golden glow on the dust-swept streets, while the last of the day's work began to wind down. The evening carried with it a stillness that made the rustling of leaves and the soft murmur of voices all the more pronounced. It was the kind of evening when everything seemed at peace, and yet Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shatter that peace. She had just stepped out of the bakery, clutching a loaf of freshly baked bread, when the sound of hooves caught her attention. At first it was a distant rumble. Quiet, unassuming. But as the rider drew closer, the sound of the horse's gait became louder, more insistent, until it filled the street, commanding attention. Sarah paused in her tracks, a chill running down her spine as she looked toward the end of the street. Through the dimming light a figure appeared, silhouetted against the fading sunset. The rider was a man, his weathered face partially obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, but even from this distance Sarah could sense the coldness that seemed to emanate from him. His posture was straight, confident, as though the very land he rode upon bent to his will. He slowed his horse as he entered the town, his gaze sweeping from side to side, scanning the buildings, the faces, the air around him like a predator scenting the wind. There was something deliberate about the way he moved, the way he observed. Too careful, too calculating. His presence cast a long, dark shadow over the peaceful evening, making Sarah's heart race with a sudden sense of foreboding. The townsfolk, who had been going about their business, stopped in their tracks, casting cautious glances toward the newcomer. A whisper rippled through the crowd like the soft hiss of wind before a storm, but no one dared approach him. The man's eyes, dark and unyielding, met Sarah's briefly, and in that fleeting moment something shifted in the air. She could feel it, A spark of recognition, but not from her. It was as if he saw something in her that made him pause, something he was searching for, something he knew all too well. The rider didn't slow his pace as he passed by her. His gaze never wavered, but Sarah could feel it, heavy and suffocating, like an invisible thread between them. A feeling of unease settled in the pit of her stomach, and her breath quickened. The path she had tried so hard to outrun, the one she had buried beneath layers of silence and distance, had found its way to her doorstep. The man rode on, his figure becoming more distant as he made his way down the road, but Sarah couldn't shake the chill that had taken root in her chest. She knew, with a certainty that gripped her like ice, that this man wasn't just passing through. He was here for a reason, and that reason had everything to do with her. The sky had darkened fully now, the stars shimmering above like diamonds scattered across black velvet. The warm light of the fire in the center of the camp flickered against the cool evening air, but Sarah barely noticed. Her mind was consumed by the rider, the stranger, and the way his eyes had locked with hers as if they shared some unspoken connection. She sat near the fire, her gaze fixed on the flames, but her thoughts kept drifting back to that brief, unnerving encounter. She could still feel the weight of his stare, heavy and unsettling. She had done her best to push the thoughts aside, but her heart kept pounding in her chest, each beat echoing with the same dread. Who was he? What did he want? The evening wore on, and the sounds of conversation and laughter swirled around her, but they seemed distant, as if coming from a place far removed from where she sat. She barely noticed Dusty as he approached, his footsteps soft on the dirt, but his presence was unmistakable. "Something on your mind?" Dusty's voice broke through the fog of her thoughts, low and steady, with a hint of concern. He stood at her side, his figure blocking the light of the fire, casting her into shadow. Sarah looked up at him, startled. She hadn't even realized he had approached. His presence was steady and grounded as always, but there was a sharpness in his gaze tonight, something that made her realize he had noticed her unease. "I saw him," Sarah said quietly, her voice trembling as she spoke the words she had been avoiding. "The rider, the man who just came into town." Dusty's brow furrowed as he crouched beside her, his eyes scanning the darkening horizon, his posture relaxed but alert. "What man?" he asked, his voice even, though there was an edge to it now, something beneath the calm. "The one who just rode in," Sarah said, her hands trembling in her lap. "He was looking for someone, I don't know why, but when he looked at me, it felt like he knew me." Dusty's gaze shifted to the direction of the distant town, his jaw tightening. His silence was loud in the stillness of the night, and Sarah could feel the weight of it pressing against her chest. He was thinking, piecing together the fragments of her words, his mind working quickly. "I think he's here for you, Sarah," he said, his voice low, the words carrying a weight that made Sarah's breath hitch. She nodded slowly, her throat tight, as if the very air around them had thickened with tension. "I think so too." Dusty didn't look at her immediately, but when he did, his eyes were intense, sharp as the flicker of the firelight on the ground. "I don't like this," he said quietly, "but I won't let him get to you, not without a fight." Sarah swallowed hard, her heart hammering in her chest. The thought of confronting the man who seemed to know something she couldn't even remember, sent a wave of panic through her. She wanted to push the fear away, to tell herself that it was all nothing but coincidence, but deep down she knew it was more than that. Dusty's hand, steady and sure, rested on her shoulder, grounding her. The simple gesture, the unspoken promise behind it, gave her a flicker of hope. She hadn't realized how much she needed that connection until now, how much she had been hiding from not just the town, but from herself. "You're not alone," Dusky said quietly, his voice calm, but there was an unmistakable strength in it, a quiet certainty. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Sarah's heart skipped a beat at his words, the weight of them sinking deep into her chest. It was a promise, a vow of protection, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a glimmer of trust flicker within her. Maybe she hadn't truly been alone here after all. But as the night stretched on and the fire burned low, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was coming, and when it did, there would be no easy way out. The stranger had arrived, and with him the past she had tried so hard to leave behind. Act 2. The market day in Silver Creek was bustling with activity as townsfolk gathered along the dirt-packed streets, the chatter of vendors and children mixing with the smell of fresh bread and ripe fruit. Stalls were lined with colourful goods, and the usual hum of commerce filled the air. Sarah had ventured into town early that morning, her heart light for the first time in days. The sun was warm on her face, and the rhythm of the town had settled around her like a comforting blanket. She felt the promise of a new beginning, the kind that whispered of healing and fresh starts. But that fleeting peace shattered the moment she heard his voice. "Sarah O'Malley!" The shout cut through the market like a whip, sharp and relentless. It was a voice she knew well, and it made her blood run cold. Turning slowly, Sarah saw him standing at the far end of the market square, the stranger, the man who had come into town just days ago. He stood tall, his dark eyes sweeping over the crowd with a calculated coldness. He was a man who belonged to no place, his presence like a stone dropped into still waters. "I said," he called again, his voice ringing out, "Sarah O'Malley, the woman who ran from her past, the woman who betrayed every trust she ever made." His voice, rough and biting, held the weight of accusation, and it stung in the open air. A hush fell over the market. The townspeople froze, their faces turning towards Sarah with suspicion. She could feel their eyes, their judgment, as they slowly turned from the man to her. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet, the warmth of the sun suddenly turning to something cold and suffocating. The stranger stepped forward, his presence like a dark cloud descending on the bright afternoon. He pointed directly at Sarah, his finger accusing, a dark gesture that made the crowd stir. "This is the woman who came into your town, hiding from the law, hiding from her past? Don't let her fool you, Silver Creek. She's as guilty as the day is long." The market, once alive with the sounds of daily life, became a place of whispers. The air was thick with murmurs, growing louder with every passing second. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and her knees felt weak. She couldn't breathe. The accusations hung in the air like a storm about to break, and there was nowhere to hide. "Leave her alone!" a voice called from the crowd, but he was quickly drowned out by a chorus of skepticism. Sarah's eyes flickered to the faces around her, faces she had come to know, to trust. They were no longer filled with warmth or welcome. Instead, they were hard, uncertain. Some looked away, while others stared with judgment written on their faces. She had built something here, had tried to leave her past behind, but in one brutal moment it all came crashing down. Her past was no longer a shadow she could outrun. It had found her. The murmur of the crowd was a low hum in Sarah's ears as she stood there, exposed and vulnerable. The world felt smaller, tighter, with each passing second. She tried to gather her breath, but it came out in short gasps. She could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on her, scrutinizing every inch of her, judging her not just for who she was, but for who she had once been. It was like a weight had settled over her, a heavy, suffocating thing, the kind of weight that crushed hope and left nothing but despair in its wake. "Is it true?" Millie's voice broke through the silence, soft and uncertain. The innkeeper's daughter stood a few paces away, her gaze flicking nervously between Sarah and the man still standing at the centre of the square. The others who had once greeted Sarah with smiles now looked at her with suspicion, their eyes narrowing. I don't know what he's talking about," Sarah stammered. Her voice sounded hollow even to her ears. The stranger's voice, still echoing in her mind, seemed to reverberate through the air. "She's guilty. She's a woman running from her past." "Maybe you should just go," Millie said quietly, her voice strained. She wasn't cruel, but there was hesitation in her tone. The doubt was there, seeping into the cracks that had once formed the fragile trust between them. The words hit Sarah like a blow, and she felt a sudden emptiness, an aching hollow in her chest. Millie wasn't the only one who had begun to turn away. Sarah could feel the coldness settling in like a shadow, a wall of silent judgment slowly rising between her and the town that had once offered her hope. One by one, the faces of the townsfolk shifted. Those who had once shown kindness now looked away, their gazes hard, narrowed. There was no room for understanding, no space for the compassion Sarah had worked so hard to earn. All that was left were the whispers and the fearful glances, and she felt the weight of their disapproval like a suffocating hand around her throat. For the first time since she had come to Silver Creek, Sarah felt truly, utterly alone. As the market slowly dissolved into murmurs and scattered conversations, Sarah found herself walking toward the edge of town, her steps heavy and slow. The warmth of the sun no longer offered comfort, and the hum of the town felt like a dull throb in her ears. She needed to escape, to find a place where she could gather her thoughts, where she could breathe. But as she rounded the corner near the saloon, she froze. Dusty was standing by the fence, his back to her, his posture tense. He had been watching from a distance, but the moment she saw him she could feel the weight of his gaze. He had seen the whole thing. Slowly she approached him, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't know what she expected. Sympathy, perhaps, or understanding, but she couldn't bring herself to say a word. "Dusty," she said, her voice small, as if speaking the name would somehow break the heavy silence between them. He turned slowly, his face unreadable. His eyes flickered over her, lingering for a moment, then looking away. The conflict was clear in his expression, and Sarah felt a sharp pang of uncertainty. "I didn't," she started, her words faltering. "I didn't do what he said. I haven't—" "I know," Dusty said, his voice gruff, but there was a distance in it, a hesitance that made her stomach churn. He crossed his arms, looking out over the horizon, as if the landscape held the answers he couldn't find in her eyes. "I've been honest with you," Sarah said, the desperation rising in her chest. She had tried so hard to leave the past behind, to build something here, to be someone new. "Why would I lie to you?" Dusty looked at her then. His expression softened, but it was pained. "You don't have to explain, Sarah. I know what it's like to run from the past." He paused, taking a breath, but the words that followed were heavy with regret. "But the truth is, I don't know if I can protect you from this." Sarah's heart dropped at his words, a cold emptiness flooding her veins. She wanted to reach out to explain, but the words died on her lips. She had spent so much time trying to prove herself, trying to be worthy of the trust she had fought for, but in this moment it felt like all of it was slipping through her fingers. Dusty's eyes met hers again, his gaze full of conflict, full of something she couldn't name. "I need to know you, Sarah. I need to know if you're still running. From the truth? From yourself?" The weight of his question settled in her chest like a stone. She couldn't answer, not now. Not when everything she had worked for seemed to be unraveling before her eyes. The silence between them stretched on, thick and heavy. And in that moment Sarah realized just how much she had to lose. The door creaked shut behind Sarah as she entered the small room at the boarding house. The familiar scent of worn wood and dust, wrapping around her like a shroud. Her fingers lingered on the doorknob for a moment, as if the simple act of closing herself away from the world might shield her from the pain and confusion that had followed her through the streets of Silver Creek. She stepped into the room, the only sound the soft shuffle of her boots against the wooden floor. The evening light filtered through the small window, casting long, faint shadows across the room. It was still, too still, like the air had thickened, pressing against her lungs, each breath becoming heavier than the last. The room, with its simple furnishings and bare walls, seemed to mock her, its quiet emptiness amplifying the ache in her chest. Sarah sank into the chair by the small table, her body aching from the day's strain, both physical and emotional. She let her head fall into her hands, her fingers pressing into her temples, as if she could push away the weight of her thoughts, but it was no use. The memories of the market, the stranger's accusations, the pointed stares, the whispers that still clung to her, pressed in from all sides, suffocating her. She had thought she could escape. She had thought Silver Creek would be a place to rebuild, to leave behind the ghosts that haunted her. But now it seemed as though those ghosts had followed her, slipping into the cracks of her newfound life, tainting the small hope she had managed to gather. The air in the room grew colder, despite the heat of the summer day fading outside. Her gaze flickered to the small mirror above the dresser, her reflection blurred in the glass, just as she felt herself fading from who she had tried to be. The woman in the mirror seemed like a stranger, her face drawn, her eyes dull and haunted. How had it come to this? She had spent so long trying to prove she was someone new, someone worthy of trust. But in the end it seemed the past always caught up with her, no matter how far she ran. Her hands trembled as she picked up the letter that had arrived for her earlier in the day, the handwriting on the envelope unmistakable. It was a letter from the one person who had once meant everything to her, the person who had betrayed her trust. The letter was a reminder of everything she had tried so desperately to forget, and yet here it was, staring her in the face, the weight of the past too heavy to ignore. With a shaky breath, she tore the envelope open, but she couldn't bring herself to read the words inside. She let it drop from her fingers, crumpling the paper against her chest as tears welled up in her eyes. The shame, the guilt, the regret, all of it came rushing back in a wave of sorrow too overwhelming to contain. How could she have ever believed she could leave it behind? How could she have thought she could start over when the shadows of her past were always just behind her, waiting to catch up? She pressed her hands to her face, trying to stifle the sob that threatened to break free. The loneliness in the room felt like it was swallowing her whole, and she couldn't escape it, not this time. The dusky light of the evening settled over the ranch as Dusty moved through the fields, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust as he walked with a purposeful stride. The ranch, with its quiet rhythm of work and life, was always a place where he found peace. But tonight that peace eluded him. His mind was heavy, clouded by the events of the past few days, and no matter how many fences he mended or cattle he tended, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through his fingers. His thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah, the way she had looked earlier, standing in the middle of the market, exposed and vulnerable, her face pale as the town turned against her. He had seen the pain in her eyes, the weight of the accusations that had been thrown at her. He had wanted to go to her, to shield her from the harsh words, but the distance between them had grown, like a wall neither of them knew how to tear down. As he walked, his mind replayed the moment they had shared by the fire just days ago, the quiet connection, the promise of support, of understanding. It had felt like the beginning of something, a bond forged in the quiet of the night. But now, with the town's judgment and the revelations about her past hanging in the air, Dusty found himself torn. Could he trust her? Could he really protect her when the very town he called home was ready to turn on her? He stopped near the barn, his hands resting on the fence as he stared out at the darkening sky. The weight of his loyalty felt like a burden now, one he hadn't expected. He had always been a man of few words, a man who let actions speak louder than promises. But Sarah's situation was different. He had seen something in her, something raw, something real, and he couldn't ignore it. But now, as the rumors swirled and the town's distrust grew, he wondered if he had made a mistake. The wind picked up and Dusty's thoughts grew more tangled, more painful. His heart tugged in two directions. One side of him wanted to stand by Sarah, to offer her the protection she needed, to be the man she could turn to. The other side, the side that had always played by the rules, that had kept his own wounds hidden, whispered that he should distance himself, that he should leave her to deal with the consequences of her past. Dusty's fists clenched at his sides. He couldn't help but feel the conflict burning inside him. If he stood by Sarah, it would mean confronting everything he had kept buried, his own past, his own regrets. It would mean risking everything he had built here, on the ranch, in Silver Creek. But if he turned away, if he let her face it alone, he knew he would regret it for the rest of his life. He turned and walked back toward the main house, the weight of his decision pressing on him like an unseen hand. The night seemed heavier than usual, the stars dim in the sky, as though the world itself was waiting for him to make up his mind. The answer wasn't easy. There was no right or wrong choice, no clear path forward. But as Dusty approached the house, he realized one thing with painful clarity. He couldn't walk away. Not from Sarah. Not from what they had shared, and not from the promise he had made to himself to fight for what was right. The ranch, the town, the land. All of it could be rebuilt, but trust, once broken, was a far more delicate thing, and Dusty knew deep down that this was a fight worth having, whether it was with the world around him or with his own heart. He couldn't let Sarah face this alone. He had made his decision. Now all he had to do was find the courage to face it. The night was thick with the weight of an impending storm. The wind howled through the ranch, carrying with it the promise of rain. The once clear sky had darkened into an impenetrable mass of clouds, and the scent of the coming storm clung to the air, heavy, pregnant with the chaos that would soon arrive. The fire that had burned brightly earlier in the evening was now little more than a flickering memory, its embers dying beneath the swell of wind. Sarah stood near the edge of the ranch, her coat pulled tight around her against the chill that had settled in her bones. She couldn't remember how long she had been walking. The sound of her boots on the gravel path was the only company she had. The rest of the ranch was quiet. Too quiet. The bustle of the day had long since faded, leaving her alone with her thoughts. And her thoughts, like the weather, were tumultuous. She had never expected her past to catch up with her so quickly, but here it was, clawing its way back into her life. The man from the market, the accusations, the town's whispers, they were all too much. She had thought she could outrun it, thought she could build a new life in Silver Creek, but instead, the shadow of who she had been hovered over her, a constant reminder of the mistakes she couldn't escape. Her chest ached, and she wrapped her arms tighter around herself, trying to ward off the feeling of isolation that had begun to take root. She had wanted to find a place where she could be someone new, someone worthy of trust, but with every passing day that dream felt further and further out of reach. The sound of hooves interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Dusty coming toward her, his figure framed by the flickering light of the distant lanterns. His silhouette was strong against the stormy backdrop, his face shadowed, but his eyes intense. She could see the weight of something in them, something that mirrored the turmoil she had been carrying inside. As he approached, Sarah's heart clenched. She had been avoiding him all evening, retreating to the solitude of the ranch to escape the confrontation she knew was inevitable. But here he was, his presence unavoidable, like the storm that was now roaring overhead. "You've been out here for hours," Dusty said, his voice low, rough with the strain of unsaid words. His gaze searched hers, but there was a distance between them now, one that hadn't been there before. Sarah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she watched the storm gather, the sky growing darker with every passing second. It felt like the world itself was preparing for something. Something inevitable. Something that was about to break. Dusty took a step closer, the tension in his posture unmistakable. "Sarah," he began, but his words faltered, the weight of them pressing on his chest. He seemed to be struggling with what to say, unsure of how to bridge the gap that had suddenly grown between them. The storm raged around them, the wind tugging at their clothes, the sound of distant thunder rolling across the sky. It was as if the earth itself was trembling, waiting for the words that had to be said. "I didn't ask for this," Sarah said, her voice breaking, the words coming out more pained than she intended. She turned away from him, her eyes fixed on the dark horizon, as if the distance could offer her some escape from the pain that was rising inside her. "I didn't ask to be a part of your life. To be a burden, to make you question everything you thought you knew?" Dusty's steps were slow as he approached her, his eyes never leaving her face. "You're not a burden, Sarah, you're not. But there are things you haven't told me, things you've kept hidden, and it's tearing us apart." Her breath caught in her throat, the weight of his words striking deep. She had always known this moment would come, but it didn't make it any easier to face. She had wanted so badly to protect him, to keep him from the truth, but now it was impossible to keep the lies from unraveling. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "I never wanted to bring this into your life, but Dusty's voice cut through her words, raw and painful. "Why didn't you trust me?" His tone was quiet, but there was a force behind it that made her chest tighten. "You've kept me at arm's length, Sarah. I've been there for you. I've stood by you, but you never let me in." "Why?" Tears welled in her eyes as she struggled to answer. "Because I'm broken, Dusty. I've done things I'm not proud of. I've hurt people." "I've hurt you just by being here." Dusty stepped closer, his hand reaching out to her, but Sarah flinched, stepping back as if his touch was something she didn't deserve. She couldn't bear it. Not now, not when she felt so shattered. "You're not broken," Dusty said, his voice firm, but his eyes were soft, filled with a tenderness that she hadn't expected. "We all have things we're ashamed of, things we regret, but you don't have to carry that alone." "Not anymore. Not with me." Sarah's heart ached at the sincerity in his voice, and the tears that had been threatening to fall finally spilled over, running down her cheeks. She didn't try to stop them. She couldn't. The weight of everything she had tried to bury, the lies, the guilt, the shame, was too much to hold inside any longer. "I've never wanted to be this person," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I've never wanted to be the one who runs, who hides, but I don't know how to stop." Dusty's hand reached for hers then, steady and unyielding. His grip was firm, and when Sarah didn't pull away, he gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing away her tears. "You don't have to stop," he said softly. "You just have to let me help you. Let me in. We'll figure it out together. I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. I promised you that, didn't I?" The storm above them raged on, but Sarah felt a quiet peace settle over her, like the calm that followed the worst of the storm. The weight of the world hadn't been lifted, but for the first time she felt like she didn't have to carry it alone. Her hands trembled as they found his, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sarah allowed herself to lean into him, her forehead resting gently against his chest. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible through the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Dusty's arms wrapped around her, holding her close, and for a moment the storm felt distant, as if they were the only two people in the world. "I'll never give up on you, Sarah. Never." In that moment, with the rain beginning to fall softly around them, the storm seemed to wash away the hurt, the misunderstanding, and the years of isolation. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but this was the first step toward healing. Together they would face whatever came next. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah allowed herself to believe in the possibility of redemption. The town hall was quieter than usual. The heavy wooden doors, wide open to welcome the evening air, allowed the faint sounds of the crickets and the rustling leaves to mingle with the murmur of voices inside. Sarah stood at the front of the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she waited for the room to settle. The familiar faces of the townspeople were gathered in the hard creaking benches, their eyes shifting uncomfortably between her and one another. The room smelled of musty wood and old paper, its walls lined with shelves of books and town records, a place that had witnessed the passing of many years, but never the kind of tension that filled the air tonight. The lanterns on the walls cast a flickering light that danced over the faces of the gathered crowd, their expressions a mixture of skepticism, confusion, and, Sarah thought, something more uncomfortable. Fear, perhaps. Fear of what her presence might mean for Silver Creek, for the stability they had long enjoyed. A quick glance at the crowd told Sarah all she needed to know. Millie sat in the front row, her face tight with concern, though her eyes were soft with understanding. Dusty was near the back. His broad frame leaned casually against the wall, but his eyes, those dark, perceptive eyes, they were filled with something close to encouragement, though tinged with the uncertainty that now seemed to hang over them both. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped forward. She had come here for one reason, to explain herself, to make them see that the person who had ridden into town, the woman who had garnered so much suspicion, wasn't the woman they thought she was. She had nothing to hide anymore. This was her last chance to prove that. Her voice, though steady, trembled slightly as she spoke. "Thank you all for gathering here tonight. I know there have been questions about me, about who I am and what I've done, and I understand the reasons for the doubts." She paused, feeling the weight of their gazes upon her. The murmurs and rustling ceased, the tension thick in the room. It was as if every eye in the room was watching her, waiting for her to either sink or swim. "I didn't come here to deceive anyone," she continued, her voice growing firmer. "I've made mistakes, terrible ones, and the man who called me out in the market today is someone from my past, someone who's been searching for me. But I am not the person he says I am. I haven't committed the crimes he accuses me of, and I will prove that to you." Sarah's heart beat faster, but she pressed on, drawing strength from the conviction she had managed to find in herself. "I have a plan to clear my name. I know it won't be easy, and I know it won't be quick, but I will gather the evidence I need to show you all that I am who I say I am, that I am worthy of your trust." A silence followed, so thick that Sarah could feel the air pressing down on her. The only sound was the distant crackling of a fire outside, the flicker of the lanterns, and the low murmur of a few uncertain whispers. Her palms felt clammy, but she forced herself to meet their eyes. "I'm asking for your patience, for your understanding while I prove myself." The room remained tense, and the feeling of skepticism lingered like a storm cloud overhead. But then one voice rose from the crowd, sharp and cutting. "How do we know you're telling the truth?" The voice came from old Mr. Timmons, the blacksmith, a man known for his gruff demeanour and no-nonsense attitude. He was sitting in the back row, his hands resting on the handle of his cane. "You've got a past, Sarah, one that seems to follow you wherever you go. How can we be sure that this is just a trick, that you're not just trying to run from whatever you've done before?" Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat, but she didn't back down. She couldn't. "I know I have no right to ask for your trust," she said, her voice low but unwavering, "but I'm asking you to see the woman I am now, not the one you might think I was." Millie shifted in her seat, her gaze never leaving Sarah's. She leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a soothing balm. "We all have things in our past that we wish we could change," she said softly. "But Sarah's been nothing but good to this town since she arrived. She's worked hard, earned her keep, and never once caused trouble. I trust her, and I believe in the person she's trying to be." There was a murmur of agreement, but it was barely a ripple compared to the doubts still lingering in the room. Some faces softened at Millie's words, but others remained sceptical, unwilling to let go of their doubts so easily. Sarah felt the heat rise in her chest. The weight of judgment was heavier than she had ever known. She wasn't sure how to make them believe her, how to make them see past the ghosts of her past that still hung in the air like smoke. But then Dusty pushed himself off the wall and took a few steps forward, his presence a solid anchor in the uncertainty that surrounded them. His eyes met hers, steady and unwavering, and for the first time that evening Sarah felt the smallest sense of relief. He was with her. No matter what anyone else thought, Dusty was standing by her. "Sarah's right," Dusty's voice rang out, calm and firm. "I've known her long enough to know she's not the woman that man claims she is. I don't know what's in her past, but I know what's in her heart, and I trust her." The room went quiet again, but there was a shift in the atmosphere. The skepticism hadn't fully lifted, but there was a crack in the wall of doubt. Sarah's heart thudded in her chest tight as she looked around the room, her thoughts racing. Dusty's words had cut through the tension, but they hadn't sealed the deal. The community wasn't won over by one man's word, not even if it came from someone they trusted. It would take more than that. Mr. Timmins looked from Sarah to Dusty and then to the others in the room. His expression remained unreadable, but Sarah could feel the shift happening, the slow thawing of the cold ice around the room. "We'll see," he said, his voice still hard but not unkind. "But you better be sure, Sarah, we've all got a stake in this town, and if you're playing us for fools, it won't be just you who suffers." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. She knew the risk, the weight of the challenge she had set before her. "I will prove myself to you, I swear it." The air was thick with uncertainty, but as the townsfolk began to murmur again, Sarah felt the weight of their gaze soften ever so slightly. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall, and for the first time in days she felt a spark of something else. Hope. The first light of dawn had barely begun to break across the horizon when Sarah and Dusty set out from Silver Creek. The night's chill still clung to the earth, and the air felt crisp with the kind of coolness that only a desert morning could offer. The sky above them was a soft wash of peach and lavender, the world slowly waking up to the promise of a new day. Sarah stood beside her horse, her fingers working quickly and methodically to fasten the saddle on Rosie. The mare snorted softly, shifting her weight as Sarah tugged the cinch tighter. The process was familiar, a routine that had become second nature to her over the past few months, but today the act of preparing the horse felt different. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders, the knowledge that once they left the town behind, there would be no turning back. No matter what awaited them, this was the path they had chosen. Dusty was already mounted, his dark silhouette framed by the fading pinks and purples of the sky. He hadn't said much that morning, his expression unreadable as he sat tall in the saddle, his eyes scanning the distance. He was a man of few words, but the quiet presence of him beside her felt grounding, a constant in a world that had been anything but stable. The first stirrings of sunlight illuminated the rolling plains that stretched before them, the soft golden light casting long shadows over the land. The endless expanse of prairie seemed to whisper of freedom, of the untamed possibilities that awaited them. The towering mesas and jagged canyons that dotted the horizon looked both inviting and intimidating, their rough contours a reminder that the land was as beautiful as it was dangerous. Dusty nudged his horse forward, the sound of hooves cutting through the stillness of the morning. Sarah followed suit, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something about leaving Silver Creek behind, about stepping into the unknown, that stirred a sense of adventure in her veins. But it also brought with it a deep unease, a sense of risk that was as wide and empty as the plains before them. They rode in silence for the first few miles, the only sound the steady rhythm of hooves on dirt and the distant call of a lone bird overhead. The land around them was vast, the horizon stretching out to meet the sky in an endless line. The wind picked up, brushing against Sarah's cheeks with a cool breath, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and earth. It was a land that felt both ancient and new, a land that held secrets beneath its surface. Secrets Sarah was determined to Her gaze drifted over the land before her, the terrain shifting from flat, open fields to low hills, then rising into rocky outcrops that looked like jagged teeth against the sky. The sheer scale of it all was overwhelming, both beautiful and brutal in its rawness. But as she rode alongside Dusty, the weight of her past seemed to lift, if only a little. She had spent so long hiding, running from her mistakes, but now, in the vast openness of the plains, she felt the first stirrings of something else, a sense of possibility. Perhaps here, in the open spaces of the world, she could finally find the truth she had been searching for, and perhaps for the first time find a place to call home. The landscape stretched on for hours, the heat of the midday sun pressing down on them as the miles piled up behind them. The terrain was rugged, the trail winding through ravines and rocky outcroppings, the path often narrowing to a faint line through the grass. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, Sarah could feel the weight of the land pushing against them, its harshness a reminder that the journey ahead would not be easy. The sun beat down mercilessly, the air thick with heat. The trail was rough, and Rosie's hooves kicked up clouds of dust that hung in the air like a thick veil. Sarah wiped the sweat from her brow, her face flushed with the heat of the day. She glanced over at Dusty, who rode with a calm, steady rhythm, his eyes focused ahead, unbothered by the discomfort of the heat. He was a man who had been shaped by the land, who knew its rhythms and its dangers, and she could see the way he moved through it effortlessly, like a part of it. But it wasn't long before the land began to turn against them. A gust of wind whipped through the canyon they were riding into, the air growing suddenly colder, a warning in the way the wind howled through the narrow pass. Before Sarah could react, a swirling mass of sand seemed to appear from nowhere, blinding her, stinging her face like 1,000 tiny needles. The sandstorm came on fast, without warning, and soon the world around them was reduced to nothing but the swirling brown of dirt and dust. "Stay close!" Dusty's voice cut through the roar of the storm, but Sarah could barely hear him over the howling wind. She spurred Rosie forward, her eyes squinting against the sting of the sand, following the dark shape of Dusty ahead of her. She could feel the storm's fury in the way the horse shied, the dust swirling around them, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The storm lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. When the wind finally died down and the air cleared, they found themselves at the edge of a ravine, the rocky ground uneven beneath their horses' hooves. "Are you all right?" Dusty asked, his voice rough from the storm, his gaze sweeping over her with concern. Sarah nodded, though her heart was still pounding in her chest from the unexpected violence of the storm. She wasn't used to this, the rawness of nature, the unpredictability of it. But as they paused at the edge of the ravine, Sarah could feel the strength in Dusty's presence, the way he stood grounded and steady, as if he had seen this all before. They continued on, but the land became more treacherous. The trail wound through narrow ravines where the cliffs on either side seemed to close in, the path growing steeper and more difficult. Sarah's muscles ached from the constant ride, and the strain of the trail was beginning to show. Her breath was laboured, the weight of the journey settling into her bones. But through it all, Dusty's presence beside her was a steadying force, his quiet strength something she hadn't realized she needed until now. The hardest test came when they encountered a group of outlaws. They appeared without warning, their horses emerging from behind a cluster of boulders. Dusty's hand was on his rifle before Sarah even had time to react. "Stay behind me," he muttered, his voice low, but his body tense, ready for whatever might come. The outlaws were rough-looking men, their faces hard, eyes full of the kind of recklessness that spoke of a life lived without rules. They circled Dusty and Sarah, their horses moving in a slow, menacing rhythm. "This is our land," one of the men said, his voice harsh, "and we don't take kindly to strangers." Sarah's heart raced, the adrenaline flooding her veins as the situation unfolded. She could feel Dusty's protective presence beside her, his hand steady on his rifle, and though she was terrified, she felt a surge of something else, something fierce, something that pushed her to act. "I don't want any trouble," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear that twisted in her chest. "We're just passing through." Dusty's gaze never wavered, his body tense as he kept his focus on the outlaws. He was a man who didn't let fear control him, a man who faced danger head-on, and as the standoff stretched on, Sarah found herself feeling the same kind of strength in herself. She wouldn't let fear take over, not this time. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the outlaws seemed to sense that they weren't going to get the upper hand. With a few muttered curses, they turned their horses and disappeared into the canyon. Sarah exhaled a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She glanced at Dusty and their eyes met for the briefest of moments. A shared understanding, a bond forged in the heat of the moment. "We make a good team," Sarah said softly, a wry smile tugging at her lips. Dusty nodded, his expression softening, though his gaze was still alert, scanning the horizon. "We do." As they continued on, the challenges of the trail were far from over, But Sarah knew one thing with certainty: she had found something in herself she hadn't known was there. And as they rode side by side, the landscape stretched out before them, wild and untamed, just like the journey ahead. The desert town was a speck in the vast barren landscape, its rough-hewn buildings seemingly carved out of the earth itself. As Sarah and Dusty rode into the small settlement, the dust clung to the air, coating everything in a fine layer of sand. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the weathered storefronts and crumbling walls. The town seemed almost abandoned, its few inhabitants keeping to themselves in the heat of the late afternoon. It was a place where people came and went, but nothing ever seemed to stay for long. Dusty's expression was unreadable as he led Rosie and his own horse toward the stables. His eyes scanned the empty street with the practiced caution of someone who had seen the darker side of the world and knew how to navigate it. Sarah followed closely behind, feeling the weight of the silence around them, as if the town itself was holding its breath. She had been to many places, but this one felt different. It felt as if time had stopped here, as though it was a place for people who were running from something, people like them. When they reached the stables, Dusty handed the reins to the stableman, an old man whose face was deeply lined with age and hardship. His hands shook slightly as he took the horses, his eyes flicking warily toward Dusty, then toward Sarah. There was no question in his gaze, just the quiet recognition of someone who had seen the storm coming long before it arrived. "Name's Sam," the old man grunted as he led the horses into the stable. "You'll find him at the saloon." Dusty nodded, his jaw tight, and Sarah could see the flash of recognition in his eyes as he spoke. "I'll catch up with you later." As they made their way to the saloon, the oppressive heat of the desert wrapped around them like a cloak, the dry wind biting at their skin. The saloon was a small, low building with a faded sign that creaked in the wind. Dusty paused at the door, his hand resting on the weathered wood, his gaze sweeping the street one last time before he pushed the door open. The saloon was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of tobacco and stale whiskey. A few patrons sat hunched over their drinks, their conversations hushed, as though speaking too loudly might break the fragile peace of the place. In the corner, a man sat alone, his back to the door, nursing a cup of coffee. He was older than Dusty, his face lined with years of hard living, but there was something familiar in the way he carried himself, something that spoke of past battles and hard-won survival. Dusty's eyes locked on the man, and for a moment there was a flicker of something, recognition maybe, or perhaps something more complicated. Without a word, he walked toward the man, Sarah following quietly behind. "Jake?" Dusty said, his voice low, but the weight of it filled the space between them. The man, Jake, looked up, his gaze narrowing slightly as he saw Dusty. There was a brief moment of stillness, then a slow, deliberate smile spread across Jake's face. He stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor, and extended his hand to Dusty. "Didn't think I'd see you around here again," Jake said, his voice rough, as though it hadn't been used much in recent days. "Guess the past has a way of catching up to you, don't it?" Dusty took his hand, shaking it firmly, but his eyes never left Jake's. There was a history there, a shared understanding between them. Sarah watched the exchange quietly, sensing the weight of the bond between them, a bond forged in shared struggles, in battles fought and lost, and perhaps won, too. "Not by choice," Dusty replied, his voice tight. "We've got trouble, Jake, trouble that's been following us." Jake motioned toward a nearby table, and the two men sat, Sarah taking the seat opposite them. Jake's eyes flicked toward her, but he didn't speak. Instead, he poured another cup of coffee, the dark liquid sloshing into the chipped mug with a dull, resigned sound. "Go on," Jake said, leaning back in his chair, his hands folded across his chest. "You've come for answers, I reckon." Dusty took a deep breath, leaning forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Jake's. "We're looking for a man, a dangerous one. His name's Roland Vasseur. You know him?" Jake's eyes flickered just for a moment, but it was enough for Sarah to catch the subtle shift in his demeanor. There was recognition there, something in his eyes that spoke of a history they hadn't yet discussed. He set the coffee pot down with a soft clink and exhaled slowly. "I know Vasseur," Jake said quietly, his voice lower now, as though speaking the name aloud brought with it the weight of old memories. "Not a man you want to mess with, I'll tell you that. He's a snake. A man who knows how to disappear when the heat gets too hot. But he's dangerous, real dangerous. And he's made more enemies than I can count." Sarah felt a chill sweep through her. Her heart pounded as she processed the information. Roland Vasseur. The name sounded familiar, though she couldn't place where she had heard it before. She glanced at Dusty, her stomach tightening. Jake continued, his voice steady but edged with caution. "Vasseur's been in and out of this part of the country for years. He's a man of many faces, depending on who he's trying to fool. But one thing's certain, if you're looking for him, you better be ready for a fight." Dusty nodded, his jaw set. "We've faced him before. He's got a way of turning people against each other, using their fears, their weaknesses. We need to find him before he causes more damage." Jake stared at Dusty for a long moment, his gaze unreadable, before finally giving a slow nod. "I can help you," he said, his voice low. "But it's not going to be easy. Vasseur's been on the move for too long, and the people he's left behind aren't the kind who forget easily." The conversation settled into a quiet rhythm, the weight of their words hanging heavy in the air. Sarah watched the two men exchange details, their voices hushed but filled with a shared understanding of the danger they faced. She could see the resolve in Dusty's face, the unspoken promise that no matter what it took, he would see this through. Jake's gaze turned toward Sarah then, his eyes calculating, assessing. "You're in this too, then?" he asked, his voice not unkind but guarded. Sarah nodded, her chin lifted. "I don't have a choice. This man, Vasseur, is tied to my past. I need to make things right." Jake's gaze softened ever so slightly, though it was still wrapped in the hard edges of a man who had seen too much. "Well then," he said with a slow smile, "looks like we're all in this together." There was a long silence, but in that silence something shifted. A bond was forged between them, one that wasn't based on the past, but on the dangerous road ahead. A road that would lead them into the heart of Vasseur's darkness, where the stakes were high and the risk of failure was too great to consider. "All right," Jake said, his voice firm now. "Let's figure out how to put this bastard down for good." Dusty's eyes met Sarah's, and for the first time in days she saw something more than just the uncertainty that had clouded his gaze. There was determination there, a spark of hope. Together they weren't just searching for a man, they were searching for redemption. The canyon stretched before them like an ancient scar, a jagged cut through the earth that had weathered centuries of wind and rain. The walls of red rock rose steeply on either side, their uneven surfaces cast in the deep shadows of the late afternoon. It was a place of stark beauty, where the land seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something to unfold. The sky above was heavy with dark clouds, the scent of rain thick in the air, adding a sense of urgency to the already taut atmosphere. Sarah and Dusty had ridden for hours, their horses picking their way carefully through the rocky terrain. The journey had been long, and the strain of it was beginning to show on their faces. Dusty's jaw was set tight, his eyes scanning the landscape with a sharp, unwavering focus. Sarah rode close behind, her heart pounding in her chest, as the distance between them and the man they sought grew shorter with each passing mile. Vasseur. The name had haunted Sarah since the moment she had learned he was after her. The man who had once been her greatest betrayal, the man who had left her broken, now stood at the centre of her journey, his dark influence twisting the very air around them. He had been elusive, a ghost in the wind, always a step ahead, always just out of reach. But now, in this remote canyon, Sarah felt a gnawing certainty that they were close, too close. The horses' hooves clattered against the rocks, the sound echoing in the canyon's stillness. Sarah pulled Rosie to a stop, her breath catching as she scanned the surroundings. The narrow pass before them seemed almost too quiet, too empty. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of impending rain, the sky growing darker by the minute. Dusty had stopped just ahead of her, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. Sarah's heart clenched as she followed his line of sight to the far end of the canyon, where the faint outline of a figure appeared, tall, cloaked in shadows and standing as still as the canyon itself. "That's him," Dusty murmured, his voice a low growl of recognition. The weight of those words settled heavily between them. Sarah's throat tightened, her fingers tightening on the reins as the reality of the moment pressed in on her. This was it, the culmination of everything they had been through, everything they had fought for. The past, the danger, the betrayal, all of it came to a head in this moment, under the darkening sky of the canyon. Dusty turned to her, his gaze steady, but there was a tension in his eyes that spoke volumes. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice softer than it had been in days, as if the weight of the question mattered more now than it ever had before. Sarah's breath caught in her chest, and for a fleeting moment she considered walking away, turning back to the safety of the familiar, of the town she had left behind, the people who might have once understood her. But then she remembered the price of that escape. She remembered the pain of the lies she had carried, the secrets that had shaped her life. She wasn't running anymore, not from him, not from anyone. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady, though her heart thundered in her chest. She turned her gaze back to the figure standing at the canyon's edge, her mind sharp with the knowledge that the man she sought was no longer a shadow. He was real, standing before her, waiting. Dusty nodded and moved forward, his movements deliberate and controlled. Sarah followed close behind, the distance between them and Vassar shrinking with each step. The tension in the air was palpable now, thick with the anticipation of what was to come. The storm was building, the winds picking up, as if nature itself recognized the magnitude of the moment. As they drew closer, Vassar's figure grew clearer, his face now visible in the faint light of the storm-darkened sky. He stood with a casual arrogance, as though he knew they would come for him. His eyes, cold and calculating, flicked over Dusty first, then settled on Sarah, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice smooth but laced with something darker. "I just didn't think you'd bring company." Dusty's hand rested on his gun, his posture relaxed but ready. "We're here for you, Vassar. We're done running." The man's smile faltered for just a moment, then returned, more sinister than before. "Running? No, I don't think you've been running. You've been playing a game, Dusty. A dangerous one." Vassar's eyes turned back to Sarah, and she felt a chill slide down her spine as his gaze met hers, dark and filled with an unsettling mix of recognition and contempt. "And you," he continued, his voice a low, dangerous drawl. "You've always been a wild card. I wondered when you'd show your face again." The air between them seemed to grow heavier, the weight of years of secrets pressing down on them. Sarah stood her ground, meeting his gaze with defiance, even as the storm around them began to intensify. The wind whipped through the canyon, the trees rustling violently, the scent of rain growing stronger by the second. "You don't get to control this any more," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the rising tension. "I'm taking back what's mine." Vassar's laugh was low, cruel, and it echoed in the canyon, bouncing off the walls in jagged reverberations. "Taking back what's yours? You never had control, Sarah. You were always just a pawn in my game. And now look at you, a lost little girl playing hero." Her heart pounded in her chest as the words stung, but she didn't flinch. She had come too far to let him bait her. "Not anymore," she said, her voice firmer now, stronger. "The past ends here." Vassar's eyes darkened, the amusement fading as he took a step forward, his posture shifting from casual to dangerous. "If you think you can walk away from me after everything you've done, you're fooling yourself." The storm broke then, a crack of thunder splitting the sky as the rain began to fall in sheets, heavy and unrelenting. The earth beneath their feet trembled as the storm surged through the canyon, the wind howling like a wild beast. Sarah's heart raced, her breath quickening as the tension between them reached its breaking point. Dusty's voice was a low growl, barely audible over the storm, but there was no mistaking the resolve in it. "It ends now, Vasseur." In that moment the storm seemed to echo the intensity of their confrontation. The rush of rain, the howling wind, the crackling energy in the air. Sarah could feel the weight of the choice before her. This was the moment where the past would either break her or set her free, and as Vasseur took another step forward, his face twisted with contempt, Sarah steeled herself for the battle that was about to unfold. There would be no turning back. This was their reckoning. The storm still raged, the wind howling as the sky cracked open with a flash of lightning, followed by an ear-splitting clap of thunder that seemed to echo the fury in Sarah's chest. The canyon walls trembled with the force of it, the air thick with rain, the tension of the confrontation escalating with every passing second. Dusty stood a few paces behind her, his presence solid, unwavering. His steady gaze never left the man they had come to confront, the one who had sought to destroy her. Vasseur stood there, his posture relaxed, as if he held all the power. His eyes glittered with malice, the storm above reflecting the darkness inside him. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't. Not now, not when everything she had fought for was on the line. "You still don't get it, do you?" Vasseur sneered, his voice cutting through the storm's roar. "I've watched you struggle, watched you try to fit into this little town, pretending you're someone different, but I know the truth. I know what you are." The words struck her, but she held her ground, her chin lifting just a fraction higher. "You know nothing about me," she said, her voice sharp, steady. "You only know the lies you've told, the lies that kept you in control." Vasseur chuckled darkly, a sound that seemed to rise with the wind. "Lies? Hardly. You were nothing but a pawn in my game, Sarah. I gave you everything, everything you ever wanted, and you threw it all away for what? A few fleeting moments of freedom?" His words, laced with contempt, were meant to provoke, but Sarah didn't flinch. She had heard it all before. He had used her, betrayed her, and now he was trying to manipulate the truth to cover his tracks. He had always been a man who thrived on control, who twisted people to his will, but she had seen through him once before, and she wouldn't let him win again. "I never wanted your false promises," Sarah said, her voice cold and steady. "You thought you could use me, and for a time you did. But not any more. Not this time." Vasseur's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing with growing fury. He took a step closer, his hand reaching for the knife at his belt, but Dusty's voice cut through the tension, a low growl of warning. "Don't even think about it," Dusty said, his hand on his gun, his body tense and ready. "You're not in control here, Vasseur." Vasseur's hand stilled, and for a moment the world seemed to freeze. The wind whipped around them, but there was a quiet intensity in the air now. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing between them. "What do you think you can do, Dusty?" Vasseur sneered, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes now. He glanced towards Sarah, then back to Dusty. "You think you've got her figured out? She's nothing but trouble. You know she's been hiding from the law, don't you?" Sarah's stomach twisted, but she stood her ground. She had nothing to hide any more. "You're wrong," Sarah said, her voice calm but unwavering. "I'm not running from the law. I'm running from you." Vasseur's lips curled into a sneer, and for a moment Sarah thought he might charge, but instead his gaze flicked to Dusty, a look of cold calculation crossing his face. "You've always been too noble, Dusty," Vasseur said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Too willing to play the hero. But the truth is, you're just like the rest of them. All of you are pawns in my game. You just don't see it." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't allow herself to be rattled. She was done with fear. It had no place here anymore. "I'm not your pawn," she said, her words fierce and unyielding. "And neither is Dusty. You think you control everything, but you're wrong. The truth is about to come to light, and you won't be able to hide behind your lies anymore." Vassar's eyes flashed with rage, but it was too late. The pieces were already falling into place. The storm above them seemed to reflect the fury in his eyes, the wind howling like a wild animal, but Sarah knew this was the moment where everything would shift. "You think you can expose me?" Vassar scoffed, but there was a tremor in his voice now. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Sarah. You never did." "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Sarah said. "You're a man driven by revenge, by greed. You've built your life on lies, on manipulation. That I won't let you destroy the people I care about anymore." Her words were like a knife cutting through the fog of his deceit. She could see the shift in his face, the subtle panic creeping into his eyes as the truth of his own words began to sink in. He wasn't in control anymore. He had never been in control. The storm that raged above them wasn't just nature. It was the reckoning, the release of years of hidden secrets and lies that had been suffocating her. The canyon walls seemed to echo the resolution of that moment, the tension breaking like a storm finally passing. As the storm subsided, the first raindrops began to fall. Soft at first, then growing heavier, the desert earth drinking in the moisture greedily. Sarah felt the coolness of the rain as it washed away the heat of the confrontation, its steady rhythm soothing the rawness inside her. The canyon, once an oppressive, suffocating place, now felt like a place of renewal. The tension in the air had broken, and she stood taller, more sure of herself than she had ever felt before. Vassar stood before them, his face twisted with a mixture of rage and disbelief. His hand hovered near his belt, but he made no move. Dusty stood firm beside Sarah, his presence unwavering. The truth had come to light, and there was no way for Vassar to twist it back into shadows. His time had passed. "You've lost," Sarah said, her voice low and steady, but carrying the weight of everything that had led to this moment. "There was nowhere left for you to hide." Vassar's lips curled into a snarl, but his words faltered. The power he had once held over her, over Silver Creek, was crumbling in the face of her truth. The walls he had built with lies were crumbling, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. The rain fell in earnest now, the heavy droplets soaking them both, but Sarah didn't move. She wasn't running anymore. The storm around her, the storm in her heart, it was over. She had faced it, and she had won. Dusty turned to her then, his eyes filled with pride, though his face was still set with determination. He reached for her, his hand brushing hers in the rain, the contact steady, grounding. "You did it," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of everything unsaid. Sarah nodded, her chest tight with emotion. "We did it. Together." They had confronted the past, faced the darkness that had threatened to consume them, and emerged stronger. The canyon was no longer a place of danger and fear, it was a place of triumph, a place where they had unmasked the truth, exposed the lies, and reclaimed their future. The rain washed over them, the scent of wet earth and sage filling the air, and as the storm finally passed, the world around them felt still, peaceful. Almost Sarah stood taller than before, her honor restored, her spirit unbroken, the weight of years of pain and doubt finally lifted. And Dusty stood beside her, his steady hand offering her the strength she had always needed. The canyon was quiet now, the only sound the soft patter of rain on the earth, but it was the silence of resolution, and in that silence Sarah knew this was the beginning of something new, something lasting. The sun hung low in the sky as Sarah and Dusty made their way back towards Silver Creek. The journey from the canyon had been long, their horses' hooves moving steadily along the well-worn path, the air heavy with the scent of rain and earth. The storm had passed, leaving the land fresh and damp, the air cooler than it had been in weeks. But for Sarah, the weather was the least of her concerns. She had returned to the place that had once been her refuge, but had quickly become a prison of whispers and judgment. Silver Creek, a town she had come to love, had turned its back on her at the first sign of trouble. Now, as she neared the familiar wooden buildings, the saloon on the corner, and the bakery where the smell of fresh bread always seemed to linger, she found herself unsure. What kind of welcome would they receive now? What kind of reception awaited them after all that had transpired? The streets, once filled with suspicion and fear, were now quieter, more subdued, though not without the echoes of a town in transition. The faces she had once known glanced out from windows and doorways, some with curiosity, others with wariness. The town had changed. Sarah could feel it in the air, in the way people moved and spoke, in the way the corners of their eyes followed her and Dusty. The truth had been uncovered. The storm of accusation had passed, but its effects lingered. Dusty's presence beside her, solid and unyielding, was a quiet anchor in the uncertainty that gripped Sarah's heart. His hand rested on the reins, his gaze steady as he led their horses down the main street, the sound of hooves echoing off the wooden storefronts. He didn't speak, but the sense of calm he carried with him was something Sarah had come to rely on. The bakery was the first to greet them, the familiar sign swaying gently in the breeze. Sarah's heart tightened as she thought of Millie, the girl who had once been her closest friend, the one who had stood by her even when the town turned against her. But now, what would she think? Would Millie see her as the woman she had always been, or the woman shaped by a past she hadn't been able to outrun? As they approached the saloon, Sarah saw a small group of people gathered by the doorway. They paused as she and Dusty approached, their faces a mixture of recognition and uncertainty. There were no harsh words, no pointed fingers, just an uncomfortable silence, the kind that comes when something unresolved hangs in the air. And yet, despite the tension, Sarah could feel something else. A shift, a stirring of something hopeful, if tentative. "Sarah!" a voice called, and she turned to see Millie stepping out from the crowd, her face soft with a mixture of apprehension and relief. "You're back!" For a moment, neither of them spoke. Millie stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes searching Sarah's face. And then, without a word, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Sarah in a tight embrace. The gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes. The weight of the past, the misunderstandings, the fears, they all melted away in that moment. "I'm so glad to see you," Millie whispered against her shoulder. "We've missed you, Sarah. I've missed you." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she returned the hug, her heart swelling with a relief that had been long overdue. The town wasn't lost. Not completely. There was still room for reconciliation, for forgiveness, for rebuilding what had been broken. As they pulled away, Millie's gaze flicked to Dusty, a small but knowing smile crossing her face. "It's good to see you both back." Sarah's heart swelled with gratitude as she looked at Dusty. He stood there, calm as ever, his gaze meeting hers with quiet understanding. Together they had walked through the storm and emerged on the other side. The truth had come to light, and though it had been hard-earned, it had been worth every moment of struggle. As the group began to disperse, Sarah felt a quiet weight lifting from her shoulders. The whispers had lessened, the judgment tempered by the light of truth. People were beginning to look at her differently, not with fear, but with the cautious hope of a town ready to heal. The two of them moved through the streets, the faces they passed less wary now, less uncertain. The transformation in Silver Creek wasn't complete, but it had begun. In the distance she could hear the faint sound of laughter from the square, the light clinking of glasses from the saloon. The town was alive again, not just in body, but in spirit. As they reached the edge of the main street, Sarah stopped, her gaze moving to the horizon beyond the town. The sun was beginning to dip below the mountains, casting a warm, golden glow over the land. The sky was wide, and the valley stretched out before them, untouched and full of promise. "This is where we start over," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with a quiet determination. Dusty stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Together," he said, his voice steady, his presence a rock she had come to rely on. She nodded, a small smile touching her lips. The future was still uncertain. The past would always be a part of her, but the storm had passed, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt as though she could breathe. The town, the land, the people, they were part of her journey now, and as long as she had Dusty beside her, she knew she could face whatever came next. Silver Creek wasn't perfect, but it was home, and it was a place where she could finally stand tall, no longer burdened by the shadows of her past. Together, they turned toward the heart of the town, where new beginnings waited, and where perhaps the road to redemption would lead them to even greater things. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm amber glow over Silver Creek as the town slowly stirred back to life. The morning hustle had quieted to the soft rhythm of afternoon chores, and the street that had once felt so oppressive with its judgment now seemed more welcoming. Sarah walked down the familiar dirt path, each step a hesitant but steady movement toward reclaiming what she had once lost. As she moved past the row of weathered buildings, a few familiar faces peeked out from doorways. The same people who had turned their backs on her weeks ago now regarded her with a tentative curiosity, their eyes filled with a mixture of uncertainty and, for the first time, something softer. Something approaching understanding. Sarah didn't look away. Instead, she met each gaze with quiet resolve, her chin held high as she continued on her path. At first, the interactions were short and polite. A simple nod, a brief exchange of pleasantries, nothing more. But then, as she passed Mrs. Duffy's flower stand, the elderly woman who had once offered a tight-lipped smile whenever Sarah passed stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached for Sarah's arm. "Sarah!" Mrs. Duffy's voice was hesitant, but there was an honesty in it that had been absent before. "I've heard the truth, and I want to apologize for doubting you." Sarah's breath caught. The sincerity in Mrs. Duffy's eyes a balm to the wounds that had festered in silence for so long. The older woman's face softened as she continued. "I was wrong, I see that now. You've always been good to this town, to me, and I'm sorry." The weight of the apology, so simple and yet so deeply profound, settled over Sarah like a gentle embrace. She hadn't realized how much she had needed to hear it until now. "There's nothing to forgive," Sarah said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "You did what you thought was right. But now we can move forward." Mrs. Duffy nodded, her eyes welling with unshed tears. "I hope you'll find it in your heart to let us make it up to you." She hesitated, then added, "You're a part of this town, Sarah, always have been." The words wrapped around Sarah's heart, and for a moment the world seemed to quiet as the weight of her past shifted, just slightly, into something lighter. A new beginning. As Sarah continued on her walk, other neighbours stepped forward, men and women who had once avoided her gaze, now extending apologies and kind words. The baker, Mr. Ellis, who had never quite understood her, now offered her a warm loaf of bread with a sheepish grin, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a gesture of genuine goodwill. "I've been an old fool, Sarah," he confessed, scratching the back of his neck. "I judged you too quick. Never should have let my suspicions get in the way of the truth. I'm sorry for it." With a smile, Sarah accepted the loaf, her fingers brushing his in a brief but meaningful touch. "Thank you, Mr. Ellis. It's not easy, but we all have our parts to play in the healing of this place." Dusty had remained by her side the entire time, his steady presence a silent affirmation of their shared journey toward redemption. He hadn't said much, but the way he stood behind her, offering nothing but quiet support, spoke volumes. He, too, was a part of this town's healing. His quiet strength had carried them both through the worst of times. And now, it seemed, their collective effort was beginning to take root. When Sarah reached the edge of the street, her heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. The town was healing, and so was she. Every apology, every outstretched hand was a step toward reclaiming the life she had once believed was lost forever. As she turned to Dusty, his gaze met hers with the steady calm that had always drawn her in. "You've done well," he said quietly, his voice rich with approval. She smiled softly, her heart swelling. "We've done well, together." The night air was cool and crisp, the stars overhead twinkling like diamonds in the vast endless sky. Silver Creek's streets were quieter than usual, the tension of the past months lifted, replaced by a quiet anticipation. The town had come together in a way it never had before, and now, under the blanket of stars, they would celebrate. The long wooden tables were laden with food, freshly baked bread, roasted meats, colourful fruits, and a variety of desserts that made Sarah's stomach rumble in anticipation. The scent of roasted lamb and cinnamon pies filled the air, mixing with the sound of laughter and music that began to hum softly in the background. Neighbours who had once avoided each other now sat side by side, sharing stories and passing around platters of food. The air was filled with the warmth of shared meals and shared smiles, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Silver Creek felt like a true community, a place where every person mattered, where the past could be forgiven, and where new beginnings were born. Sarah and Dusty sat together at the head of one of the long tables, their chairs close, their hands brushing occasionally as they shared a quiet conversation. The clink of glasses and the rustle of laughter surrounded them, but in this moment it was just the two of them, sitting beneath the stars, their hearts full of something new. "Look at this," Sarah whispered, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. "It's a new beginning for all of us." Dusty's gaze softened as he looked at her, his hand resting gently on hers. "We've earned it," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of all they had been through. "It wasn't easy, but we did it." Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had once believed she was destined to be alone, haunted by her past. But now, as she sat beside Dusty, with the warmth of the town surrounding them, she knew she was no longer that woman. The storm had passed. The truth had come to light. And in the light of that truth, Silver Creek had embraced her, just as she had embraced it. The sound of music filled the air again, a lively tune that had people getting to their feet, clapping and dancing in the dirt. The celebration was in full swing, the town's joy infectious, and Sarah couldn't help but smile as she watched the community she had once feared would never accept her come together in such harmony. For the first time she felt truly free, not just from the weight of her past, but from the fear that had once held her back. She was no longer the woman on the run. She was Sarah O'Malley, a part of Silver Creek, a woman who had faced the storms and emerged stronger. As she looked out at the dancing townsfolk, Dusty's steady presence at her side, Sarah felt something shift deep within her. This was where she was meant to be. This was home. And for the first time she could look toward the future, unburdened and full of hope. The first light of dawn touched the earth with the gentleness of a lover's kiss, its pale gold rays spreading across the landscape like a quiet promise. The river, a steady presence in the valley, shimmered beneath the rising sun, its surface kissed by the soft morning breeze, sending ripples through the still water. It was a place of peace, its waters constantly in motion, yet always the same, a symbol of renewal, of cycles unbroken. Sarah and Dusty walked side by side along the riverbank, their footsteps soft in the cool, damp earth. The world was waking up around them, birds singing in the trees, the rustling of leaves in the wind. But in this moment there was only the quiet sound of the river's song and the steady rhythm of their breathing. The journey they had made to reach this place felt as distant as the stars now, as if it belonged to another lifetime. And yet the weight of it all lingered, like the faintest echo in the back of Sarah's mind. She had come so far, from a life of shadows and fear to this, standing by the river, her heart light and full of hope, her past no longer a chain around her wrists. She glanced at Dusty beside her, the man who had been her steady rock when the world had threatened to break her. But his expression was calm, his gaze focused on the flowing water, but there was a quiet strength in him now that reflected the peace they had found together. His hand brushed against hers, the warmth of his touch a silent reminder of the bond they had built, a bond forged through adversity, strengthened by love. The river before them flowed relentlessly forward, its current both gentle and powerful. It was a constant, a reminder that nothing stayed the same forever. Everything changed, just as they had. Just as their love had blossomed from uncertainty and fear into something rooted and unshakable. They stopped by a smooth, weather-worn rock at the river's edge, the ground beneath their feet soft with moss and the scent of earth. The air was fresh, filled with the promise of a new day, and the quiet stillness between them was comforting, as if the world had paused to give them this moment of solitude. Sarah's gaze lingered on the water, watching as the sunlight danced on its surface, casting shimmering trails of gold. She could see her reflection in the water, distorted by the gentle ripple of the current. But beside it, she saw Dusty's, his face softened by the early light, his presence a steady force beside hers. Their reflections merged in the water, becoming one. An image of two people who had been shaped by the past, but had learned to move forward. "The river keeps moving," Sarah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It never stops. It just flows, no matter what." Dusty nodded, his voice steady as he responded. "The same could be said for us. We've come a long way, Sarah, but there's so much more ahead of us." A shiver of understanding passed between them, and Sarah felt a warmth fill her chest. The path had not been easy, but the journey had taught them both something vital: how to forgive, how to love without fear, and how to face whatever came next with courage. The river was a reminder of that, a symbol of constant change, but also of endurance, of moving forward no matter what obstacles appeared. She smiled softly, her fingers brushing against Dusty's, her heart swelling with the love she had come to know, the love that had saved her. "We're like the river, aren't we?" she said, her eyes meeting his, "always changing, always growing, but always together." Dusty's gaze softened, his hand finding hers, their fingers intertwining. "Yes," he said, his voice rich with affection. "Always together." They stood there in the quiet, the river murmuring softly beside them, its current carrying them forward, just as their lives would carry them. The past, with all its trials and turmoil, had been left behind in the wake of their journey. Now there was only the present, the promise of a future, wide open and full of infinite possibilities. The sun climbed higher, warming the earth beneath them, and Sarah felt the weight of her past finally lift. The future was ahead of them, unwritten and ready to be shaped by their hands. She and Dusty were no longer bound by the past, no longer shackled by the lies and regrets that had once defined them. They had found their way back to each other, and in the quiet space between them now, she knew that this was where they were meant to be. She looked out at the river again, watching the water as it wound its way through the land, endless and free. And in that moment, with Dusty standing beside her, she felt the certainty of something she had long ago given up hope of finding, a place where love, like the river, flowed steady and true, always moving forward, always carrying them toward new horizons. There was no more fear, no more doubt, only the vast, open future, filled with the light of 1,000 possibilities. And as Sarah looked into Dusty's eyes, she knew this was just the beginning. The early morning sun rose over Silver Creek like a promise, its golden rays painting the world in soft amber hues. The sky, once a deep indigo, now glowed with the warmth of the new day, the faint blush of dawn fading into the full brilliance of the sun. The air was crisp, fresh with the scent of earth and a lingering hint of rain. As the light spread over the town and the fields beyond, it bathed everything in a quiet, reverent glow. Dusty and Sarah stood on the rise above Silver Creek, overlooking the town below. The land stretched before them, vast and endless, the mountains in the distance crowned with the last of the early morning mist. The world seemed to breathe with the promise of the future, its quiet pulse mirrored in the steady rhythm of their hearts. They were alone in this moment, standing side by side, the silence between them comfortable, unbroken. Sarah's gaze swept over the land. The town she had once feared she would never belong to now sprawled peacefully beneath her. It was a place of beginnings, and in this quiet moment she could almost feel the weight of everything that had brought her here. The struggle, the pain, the fear. It had all led to this, but it was more than that too. It was the triumph, the reclamation of herself, the love she had found, not just in Dusty but in the community, in the quiet moments when the weight of her past had lifted just enough for her to see the future clearly. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Sarah said softly, her voice breaking the stillness like the first stirrings of wind across the plains. Her gaze never left the horizon, but there was a quiet understanding in her words, a depth of emotion that only Dusty could hear. Dusty's presence beside her was a solid comfort, a reassurance that no matter what the world had thrown at them, they had weathered it together. His fingers brushed lightly against hers, and she turned to meet his gaze. His eyes, steady and warm, spoke of a quiet strength, one that had carried them both through the worst of times. The storm was over now, but the calm they had found together was just as powerful. "Yeah, we have," Dust replied, his voice low but filled with the same quiet understanding. "We've been through a lot, and it hasn't been easy, but we made it." Sarah's heart tightened at the words, at the weight of everything that had been overcome. The past, with all its doubts and fears, was something she could finally release. The scars it had left behind would always be a part of her, but they no longer defined her. She had found a place here, a place where she could stand tall and be herself, no longer burdened by the weight of secrets or shame. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dusty," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The wind stirred her hair, and she brushed it back with a trembling hand. "I wouldn't have made it through without you." Dusty's gaze softened, his fingers tightening around hers. "You've always been strong, Sarah, stronger than you know." He paused, his voice quiet but sincere. "And now we're stronger together." For a long moment they stood there, hand in hand, watching as the sun climbed higher in the sky, spilling its golden light across the land. The world was bathed in the glow of a new beginning, and Sarah felt something shift inside her. The past had shaped her, yes, but it no longer controlled her. She had found her strength, her purpose, and it was here, in this place, beside the man she loved. "We've earned this," she said, her voice a soft declaration of the future they had fought for. "This peace, this chance to move forward." Dusty nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "We have, and we're just getting started." As the day wore on, and the last of the sun's rays began to dip below the horizon, Sarah and Dusty made their way toward the stable, the cool air of the evening wrapping around them like a familiar embrace. The town had settled into a peaceful rhythm, the quiet hum of life filling the streets. The celebration of their triumph, their return, their new beginning was still fresh in the air. But now it was time for them to move forward, together, into the life they had chosen. The horses were already saddled, the reins ready to be taken, and as Sarah approached Rosie, her heart swelled with the certainty that this was the beginning of something new, not just for her, but for Dusty, for Silver Creek, and for the future they would build. "Are we ready to ride?" Dusty asked, his voice calm but carrying the promise of adventure, the thrill of a new journey. He stood beside his horse, his eyes never leaving her, as if this was the moment they had both been waiting for, the moment when everything else faded away, and only the horizon mattered. Sarah smiled, the warmth of the day still lingering in her chest. "We are." She swung herself into the saddle, feeling the familiar strength of Rosie beneath her, the rhythm of the horse's movements a comforting reminder of everything she had learned on this journey. Dusty mounted his horse with ease, and together they rode out from the stable, the sound of hooves echoing in the quiet evening. The town, still nestled in the valley behind them, slowly faded as they rode toward the open plains. The land stretched before them, vast and untouched, the promise of the future lying in the endless expanse of open fields and distant mountains. It was a world that seemed full of possibility, full of hope, and as Sarah glanced over at Dusty, she knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The evening sky was painted with shades of deep purple and orange, the stars beginning to twinkle faintly above. The road ahead was uncertain, but it no longer mattered. They were free, together, two souls bound not just by love, but by the shared understanding of what it meant to overcome, to endure, and to rise above. "This is it, isn't it?" Sarah asked, her voice soft as the wind carried her words away. She looked over at Dusty, her heart full of something she had never thought possible, a certainty, a quiet peace that had been hard won. Dusty's gaze softened, his lips curving into a smile. This is just the beginning. And as they rode side by side, the vast, unending horizon before them, Sarah knew that the journey was far from over. But for the first time, she was unafraid. She had found her place, her purpose, and the man who would walk beside her through it all. The future was theirs, wide open and full of promise. And as the last light of day faded into the quiet night, they rode forward, hearts unburdened, into the endless possibilities of tomorrow.